An Apache arrived with a baby. She welcomed them with open arms and brought new hope to both father and child. Before the sun cut the horizon, the ranch already breathed in the low, methodical rhythm Beatriz had taught it. The pump handle creaked, the windmill moaned, a hen clucked in a half-remembered dream and settled again. In that hour between darkness and day, she moved through chores as if they were beads on a cord she'd worn thin with her fingertips. A lantern dangled from her wrist, painting her knuckles in amber and shadow. Each step had the economy of someone who had bartered with the world for every small comfort and learned not to expect change from the deal. She tied back her hair with a strip of cotton that used to be the hem of a shirt he had worn. She did not name him in the mornings. Names had weight, and mornings were for lifting. The land around her did not pretend to be kind. It was a stubborn quilt of scrub and stone, stitched with dust and little else. The stream that had once been a silver thread behind the barn now hid under reeds for half the year, and when it showed its face, it did so timidly, as if ashamed of its thinness. Fences leaned like old men, listening better with one ear than two. The gate latch stuck. Everything in that corner of the world had a habit of sticking, and Beatriz had a habit of prying it loose and making it work anyway. She spoke to the mule when she didn't speak to anyone else. The mule did not expect answers. When she scratched the patch of white between its eyes, she thought of the small seconds of touch that made up the life she'd had and lost, the pressure of a large hand on her shoulder while she kneaded dough, the careless brushing of knees under a table built too narrow. The man from those memories had gone into the fever with the same stubbornness he'd used to fight the bank. He had taken his breath with him when he left, and every morning since, she rolled the room's air between her palms before she could draw it into her lungs. On the far road, a hawk drew slow circles that meant the heat to come would be heavy. The sky wore a bruise in the west that hinted at a storm. It was the kind of storm the country specialized in. Thunder like a bad rumor, lightning like a knife, flashing but never quite cutting rain. Beatriz looked up just enough to note it. Then she bent again to the thing in front of her, which had never lied, a split board on the water trough that needed replacing. By the time the light broke the ridge, she had swept the porch, checked the salt, dragged 2 sacks of feed across the packed earth, and thought only once of leaving. She allowed herself that thought daily, the audacity of imagining another town, one with softer vowels and softer eyes. But the mule needed water, and the land was paid down, if not off. Besides, leaving would mean packing the silences as well as the cookware, and she preferred to leave the silences where they had grown. She had learned to live with them. They did not argue. They did not try to fix her. She was sanding a splinter off the trough when the shape appeared on the road. A man with his shoulders folded inward, the geometry of someone carrying more than hunger. He came from the direction of the canyon, where the scrub thickened and the rocks kept secrets. He had a bundle at his chest, cradled with one arm, while the other steadied something under his poncho. At first, from that distance and the way he moved, she thought it might be a wounded bird. Then the bundle shifted and let out a thin sound that no bird ever made, the torn whistle of a newborn's breath trying to learn the world. Her hands stopped without her telling them to. 1,000 precautions rose in her like starlings at gunshot. The county had been on edge all summer. Stories of raids, of trails ambushed and cattle gone, of fires blamed on whispers as much as on lightning. The men in town let the stories grow because stories let them shape their fear into something they could ride against. They had said Apache the way people say a curse, that is also a prayer that the thing named will look like the thing feared, so they can be right about both. She could see his eyes now. Even from where she stood, they had the tired focus of someone who had taught himself not to expect charity. She recognized that focus. She wore it herself when she walked into the general store to ask for anything that cost more than $1. His leggings were dusty, his hair tied back with a strip of leather, the kind of detail the town would use as if it were evidence instead of a decoration. The bundle in his arms shifted again and coughed. The cough had a rattle in it that pushed straight through the ribs to the core. She could have turned away. She could have let the mule bray and the barn swallow the man into a story she did not tell herself later. Her mind was already building the arguments. The council had warned them. The council had said kindness could look like foolishness if you gave it the wrong face. The council had a habit of saying things like that in rooms where they could hear their own voices echo off the rafters. They did not say those things on porches like this one, where the wood held the memory of a child's running feet and the ghost of sacrament in morning coffee. The council did not know what a closed door cost someone who had paid already. He stopped at the fence line, as if the wire itself had spoken. His lips moved. He said nothing Beatriz could hear. He did not reach for the gate. He waited in that scrim of dust and wind, a figure someone might paint as a warning if they did not know how to paint a plea. She could hear the town already, the particular hush that falls over a room when a person becomes the center of it because he does not belong. Leave him to the ranger. Don't bring trouble to your doorstep. You can't save what's already lost. Their voices collected behind her, a choir of caution taught by grief and hardened by the convenience of distance. She set the sandpaper down. The wood would still be there when the storm changed its mind for the 10th time. The mule watched her as if it already knew. She took one step, then another. She did not call to him. Names, again, had weight. If she named him, she could not put him down. Up close, the man was younger than his posture implied and older than his skin wanted to admit. The bundle was a child wrapped in a smoke-scented blanket, the fabric stiff with travel and ash. The baby's mouth opened and closed without sound between coughs, like a fish trying to learn air. Beatriz saw the telltale pull at the ribs, the flare of nostrils, the skin too hot under the grit. Fever had written its name clear as any brand. The man met her eyes and did not flinch. He had learned to let other people decide the story. He had learned this was faster. In his chest, shame made a small, hard room. It had no windows, only a door, and the door opened only onto more rooms like it. He had not wanted to come to a ranch with a gate like the one he stood before. He had wanted to solve everything with his 2 hands and his 2 feet, to build a shelter in the canyon and make the fever break by will alone. But the fever had argued that pride was a luxury the child could not afford, and he had listened, and now he stood here with the kind of weight that begged without letting the mouth form the words. The wind gathered its skirts. The bruise in the sky spread like ink in water. Thunder stepped closer. The mule snorted as if the storm had a smell it did not trust. Beatriz looked from the baby to the man and back again. Within her, something old and something stubborn argued. The old thing said she could not bury another person, not a child who did not know yet how to hold a spoon, not a man she might come to know if she let time do its heavy, miraculous work. The stubborn thing said, if she opened the door, the whole town would come in afterward. Not to help, but to question, to warn, to decide for her. She reached for the gate. The latch stuck. It always did, and always in the same way, so that her thumb already knew the exact pressure and angle. The gate swung. The man did not cross without being asked. He stepped forward only when she stepped back, opening the space that invited him to fill it. The baby's gaze drifted. Beatriz put 2 fingers lightly at the child's temple. The heat met her skin immediately, that frightening proof of a small body fighting too hard. Inside, she said. The word had a shape that surprised her. It felt as if it belonged to a former version of herself, the one who had been in the habit of making room. The house welcomed as best it could. It was not large, not pretty, but it was clean and arranged to make work easier. She had learned efficiency the same way the man had learned silence. With practice, with failure, with the patience of repetition. She set the kettle on without thinking, ladled water into the basin, stripped the baby of the blanket with the gentleness of someone who had wrapped and unwrapped the soft, stubborn future before and had not forgotten its weight. The child fussed in that lost way fevers have, as if annoyed at a dream that keeps following into waking. The man stood just inside the threshold, as if the line between out and in could still save them both if they needed to reverse time. He held his hands together, which she recognized as a way to keep them from shaking. He watched every movement she made with a soldier's attention, not because he doubted her, but because he could not bear not to know what might come next. "Boil the water," she said, and finally he moved, relieved to be given a verb and a purpose to bridle his fear. He had boiled water in creek beds and under cottonwoods, and in a camp where he was one voice among many. He had boiled water in a house once with a woman who laughed at the way he glanced at corners before he sat. The memory bit him, and he let it. Grief had made its nest, and he had stopped trying to broom it away. He set the kettle straight, adjusted the flame, used the time to look around without looking nosy, the way the table was set against the wall to leave the center of the room clear, the easy reach between shelf and stove, the photograph on the mantel turned face down under a thin web of dust. The cough came again, the rattle digging into the baby's chest like a dull knife. Beatrice's body knew, before her mind could catalogue, which herbs and cloth she had, what she did not. She had no laudanum. The shopkeeper had shaken his head at her last attempt with the kind of finality that meant he had read the council's warnings and decided to be more loyal to fear than to her face. She had willow bark, chamomile, honey that had crystallized into the shape of last winter in a jar near the window. She had hands that did not shake, and a voice that could make a sound like comfort, even when it came from the throat of someone who had tried to forget she had a voice for such things. "What do they call you?" she asked, "because names do more than one kind of work." "Chenoa," he said, and in the saying made a small space where a person could live beside the shape of his shame. She nodded, as if she had expected that name the way she expected the kettle to steam if given enough time. She told him hers, and he heard in it the echo of days he did not know yet. The storm played its prelude on the roof, heat pressed from all directions, the stove, the sky, the fever that made the child's skin feel like a warning. They did not pray aloud. They did something that looked like prayer without the words. They made a circle of hands and cloth and water and breath around the child and tightened it gently so the world's noise could not intrude. Beatrice bathed the baby's temples, dripped water onto lips that tried to refuse, and then accepted, measured breaths by counting heartbeats in her fingertips. Chenoa sang under his breath, a song not meant for this room, and therefore perfect for it. He sang not to be heard, but to give shape to the time passing. The melody was low, with the certainty of streams under ice. It said, "I am here." It said, "You are not alone." It said, "I am ashamed of needing help, and I will take it anyway." The baby's eyes fluttered, brown irises made larger by the whites gone red. Beatrice felt the flutter as a tiny thaw under her thumb. Relief sprung too early is a dangerous thing. It trips hope before hope has learned to walk. She did not let it run ahead. She kept to the rhythm. Wash, cool, lift, lower, hold, let go. She let her mind drift to practicalities because practicalities had saved her life more times than miracles. There would be a visit to the town for anything stronger than Willow. There would be eyes on her back as she asked. There would be a council meeting where people who had never met this child would decide how much value its breath had. She could hear them already, their sentences snapping shut like traps. She felt the heat rise in her, the old argument, keep your head down and your door closed, and the world will leave you alone. She had tried that. The world had not listened. Her husband had still died in the room down the hall, where the boards knew every footstep and would now always know the sound of absence. In the doorway, the sky went a hard color, and the first heavy drops traced crooked lines in the dust. The storm did not commit. It teased, then held back, like a person who comes to your porch to say they cannot stay and ends up talking for an hour. Thunder leaned on the ridge. The mule shuffled in its stall because animals trust their bodies, and their bodies tell the truth. "Fever," Beatrice said softly, as if naming it would halve it. "He needs time and cool. He needs breath that moves clean." Chenoa closed his eyes briefly, not the blink of denial, but the kind of closing that marks a decision. He would not run. He would not carry the child into the canyon to spare this woman the trouble of him. He would not pretend his pride was a blanket. He would stand, and he would take what came, and he would be grateful for everything that did not hurt, and some of what did. He opened his eyes and met hers, and she saw, in that look, the moment a man re-enters his life after grief has pushed him to the edge of it. "You can put wood on the fire," she said, and he did. "You can hold him so I can make the tea," she said, and he did. "You can sit," she added after a time, and he did, but only when she sat too. It was as if the chair might break under him if he put his weight on it before she had given the room permission to bear two sorrows at once. The baby's breath rasped, steadied, stumbled, steadied. The rhythm of the room changed to meet it. Outside, the storm wandered along the fence lines like a cow that had forgotten where it was trying to go. Beatriz's mind, which had kept itself safe by narrowing, widened without her permission. It took in the line of Chenoa's jaw and the way his hands cradled the child, with the knowledge of someone who had learned to soften his grip in time. It took in the future like a smell. Danger, yes, because men were only too eager to pour all their fear into one easy vessel and carry it to a pyre. But also the possibility that another pair of hands on this land could mean she would not have to lift every rock alone. She punished herself for the thought as quickly as it came. Then she let it stay. Hope had not earned its place. It had never in her life applied with proper references. Hope knocked. She opened. That was the sum of it. She sent him to the well for more water. He returned with it, as if the bucket were an honor. He noticed the way the rope frayed where the pulley chewed it and made a note in the quiet of his mind. Fix the rope. Thank the rope for lasting as long as it did. Replace it before it snaps. He noticed, too, that the yard had the many small scars of a person who had repaired instead of replaced, the signature of survival. He understood that signature. He wore it in his clothes and in the careful way he breathed around other people so as not to take more air than he was owed. The kettle shrieked, then settled. The tea became bitter and useful. Beatriz sweetened it just enough to convince the tongue to accept what the body needed. She touched the baby's lips with the spoon and waited as the swallow reflex argued, and then obeyed. She measured out the patience required and found she had more than she feared. She had cultivated it like a garden in a drought, thin leaves on stubborn plants. But it was there, and it grew with use. They said nothing about the town. Their silence did the speaking. They knew what a visit would cost. They knew why the shopkeeper would refuse. They knew the way fear could turn into policy faster than you could say the word mercy. They knew the council's faces and their manner of regret that looked good in a ledger. Beatriz wiped the baby's forehead again. A small sweat had begun, the good kind that means the body has found enough water to carry heat away. She let the relief touch her ankle and climb only to her calf. She would not let it reach her heart yet. She had learned that the heart is a poor place to store anything but the present tense. "Thank you," Chenoa said finally, the words simple, heavy as coins. He did not add a promise to leave or an explanation of how he had come here. Those stories would come if they needed to. Right now, in this room, the only story that mattered was the one that began with a baby breathing and went on to the next breath. "You'll work," Beatriz said, not unkindly, because bargains make the world understandable. "You'll keep to the ranch for now, until he's better." His nod was an oath. In his mind, shame cracked a window in its small room. Air came in. It smelled like wet dust, like a storm that had decided to do a little good after all. Exhaustion found him then, heavier because he was at last at the edge of putting it down. He swayed, corrected, set his jaw. "You can sleep later," she said, and he almost smiled because she had caught him in something he had not intended to show. The almost smile did not break his face. It only convinced it there were other shapes available. Outside, the thunder finally tore itself into rain. It came in a gray sheet that made the yard new for an hour. The roof received it gratefully. The parched earth tried to drink all at once and failed, and tried again. The storm softened the edges of everything until the world looked like a charcoal drawing. Beatriz listened to it the way she listened to a story she had heard in childhood and only now understood. Inside, the fever did what fevers do. It fought. It did not care about fences or counties or the committees that met in the name of safety. It cared about the cells it burned and the breathing it interrupted. Beatriz and Chenoa, in answer, did what people do when they are better than their fear. They made a space and filled it with attention. At some point, when the rain cooled the air enough to make the window breathe, the baby slept. The sleep had the loose grace of trust. The rasp became a sigh. Beatriz's shoulders dropped one notch, then another. She let herself look at Chenoa directly, not as the carrier of danger or debt, but as a man who had asked the world if it would give him one small thing, time, and had for the moment been told yes. Her vow rose then, clear and quiet. She had said it years ago over a body grown too still. I will not bury another loved one. It had guided her toward hardness, because hardness looks like strength when your arms are empty. Now the vow turned its face. It said, I will not let fear make the decisions meant for love. It said, I will learn the difference between surrender and welcome. It said, I will open the door even when the town whispers, especially when the town whispers, because doors are for opening and whispering is for people who prefer not to stand in the rain. On the road, the council's stories still walked in their boots. The town, with its tidy porches and nervous dogs, would not approve. Approval had built fences that sometimes kept wolves out and sometimes kept compassion in. Beatriz felt the shape of that disapproval and filed it where she kept other useful warnings. Snakes in tall grass, ledger's dew, winter's first bite. She would heed what she must and ignore what she could. She would fight what needed fighting and choose again and again the thing in front of her that breathed. She moved a chair to the child's side and sat. Chenoa settled on the floor near the door, not because he felt unworthy of furniture, but because he had never outgrown the habit of readying himself between the people he loved and what might come through any opening. The storm thinned. The light returned, washed clean, and found the room already changed by the simple act of two strangers choosing to be less separate. In the quiet, the house remembered other breaths, other nights. The dust motes danced in the narrow sun, small galaxies doing their work without permission. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, someone would choose fear today and call it wisdom. Here, a woman and a man who had been taught by grief to keep their hands to themselves reached toward the same fragile life and took hold, not of each other yet, but of the thread that might lead them both out of the lives they had learned to endure. When the baby stirred and sighed, Beatriz felt the sound in her bones. Chenoa's head lifted. For a moment they both smiled, not the wide smile that invites celebration, but the small, private one a person gives to a room when it has earned something. No words marked the moment. It did not need markers. It simply was. And then, as if the day could not bear to be only gentle, a gust of wind shoved at the door, a reminder of the world beyond the walls. The latch held, the house held. Within it, the fragile hold on the world grew a fraction stronger, and with it the quiet, undeniable fact that three lives had turned toward each other in a land that preferred them not to. By morning, the storm had left more scent than water, a memory of wet dust that made the earth smell like it was trying to learn kindness. The air was cooler and thin, and that thinness made every sound travel farther. From the porch, Beatriz could hear the church bell 2 miles away try to persuade a fractured town into one room. The baby had sweated through the worst of the night and lay now with lips parted, breath warmer but less ragged, a light sheen on the brow that meant the body was moving again in a rhythm that could be trusted for an hour at a time. She set a finger near the small ribs, not touching, counting the rise and fall as if numbers could tether a life to the world. When she reached 20 without a stumble, she let her breath go and rose to stoke the cook stove. Chenoa was already outside, the kind of man whose body refused the pretense of rest when there was a task within reach. He had uncoiled the frayed well rope she had noticed and laid it straight across the yard, fingers working the fibers to learn where time would betray. He did not ask for permission to fix what could kill a person in 1 bad second. He asked with his hands, and his hands were precise. The knife he used had a handle burnished by other mornings, the blade nicked in the places that showed it had been used for every kind of duty, except the showy kind. When he saw her in the doorway, he stood without the quickness of guilt. He set the knife down, palms open, a man announcing his intention to mean no harm in a country where harm had more than one language. "It'll hold today," he said, voice low enough to be offered rather than pressed upon her. "But it will lie tomorrow if we don't give it new line." She nodded. A person could build a life on the difference between today and tomorrow if they were honest about the distance. She wanted to ask how he knew ropes like that. She wanted to ask how many wells had given him their secrets. She did not ask because this was not a morning for cataloguing past lives. This was a morning for deciding what to do with the one that had arrived at her door, wrapped in a blanket and carried by a man who had taught his face to stay still. He came to the threshold and stopped again, as if it were a river with a current that could decide for him. She was called Nita, he said, without looking at the bed where the child slept. The words fell awkwardly. Not because English was a stranger, he wore it with the same unfussy competence as he wore silence, but because truth had to be handled slowly or it cut the wrong person. The child's mother. Bandits took the horses on the long trail. She tried to run, to make a noise, to give a mark for the spirits to follow if we died. They wore pieces of uniforms, blue cloth, a brass button with an eagle, a deputy's star stitched to a vest that wasn't made for it. Like they had been many men before and did not care which one fit that day. The details entered the room like cold air. The brass and blue did what details do. They offered an easy shape for blame to pour itself into. Beatriz felt how quickly the town would take those pieces as proof, how they would declare they had known it all along, how rightness would bloom in them like fever, hot, persuasive, blinding. She also heard what he did not say, that the wrong men might profit from those symbols, that someone had dressed in other people's power to steal more than a horse. In the place where mistrust and experience meet, she filed the fact and did not hang a verdict on it. "We will need medicine," she said, "the good kind, the kind the shopkeeper keeps in the drawer he locks when the bell rings." She wiped her hands on her skirt. "The council will meet. They will not like that their locked drawer should be opened for the likes of us." Chenoa accepted the pronoun as if it had always been his to carry. "I will not go," he said. "If I stand in that room, they will need fewer words to do what they already want to do. You go. I will keep the boy breathing." She listened for the tug in his voice when he named the child. Boy, not son, a small defense only grief would think to build. "If the town asks what claim I have," she said, "I'll tell them the only one that mattered last night. He was here and he was burning." He looked at her then, full on, and the look acknowledged a bargain she had not yet articulated. In that look, she saw the bruise of shame and the skeleton of pride trying to stand under it. Something in her relaxed that had been drawn bow-tight for too long. She turned away before her face betrayed her, tied her hair, wrapped the baby again, and lifted him carefully. He murmured and did not wake. On the table, she left a note no one would read but herself. Water cooling, tea steeping, willow bark here. Notes were for people who feared forgetting. She feared nothing so much as forgetting the next right thing. The church was whitewashed and tired, a face scrubbed too hard too often. Its bell did not stop when the pews were full. It stopped when the men who liked to start meetings had found their place and measured the air, and were satisfied they could be heard without effort. Beatriz sat near the back, so she could leave, if leaving became the only safety left. The baby made the small sounds of a creature convinced the world would not be cruel in this hour. She drew the blanket higher and kept her eyes forward. The councilman had expressions perfected in the mirror of leadership, grave, patient, troubled for the good of others. Next to them stood the drover, who had already appointed himself the town's necessary anger. His knuckles were split, healed, split again, the cycle of a man who liked using his hands for speaking. The pastor folded his palms in that slow way that asked for calm, without betraying the fact that he was afraid of people, not of God. "Friends," said the eldest councilman, and the word almost managed to sound like inclusion instead of prelude to punishment. "We have had troubles, we have had raids, we have lost cattle and sleep, and some say our nerve. Under these conditions it is not unkind, it is not unchristian to insist on prudence. We've had report of an Apache man at the ranch of Beatriz, Cordova. We've had report of a child." The room made a small noise at the word child. People are rarely as consistent as their policies. The syllables child and fever can puncture arguments made of steel. The drover leaned forward as if to pull those syllables back. "We will not turn this town into a camp for strays," he said. "We will not invite danger to our tables. We all heard about the uniforms." He paused to let the detail bloom. "What is a bandit who can dress like a soldier, but a soldier on the wrong day? Maybe right on the next." A murmur approved the permission he offered to hate two things for the price of one. Beatrice stood. The decision arrived like a quiet placed in her hands, not like a torch she could trip over. She did not raise her voice. The strength of certain words is that they make rooms lean in. "I heard about the uniforms," she said. "I also heard the cough of a baby who did not choose any of this. I heard the way his chest tried to lift and could not because the air was too heavy. I heard the rain refusing to commit. I will not hear the sound of a child stop breathing in my house because you are afraid of what a coat meant on another road." The pastor's eyes warmed at the edges. That did not mean he would help. It meant he remembered his mother. "A week," she said before they could make the noise that swallows a woman whole. "1 week, 7 nights. If by then the child is worse, I will bring him to your door and let you close it. If by then the man has given you cause to fear, I will turn him away myself. If by then you find your lost cattle tied to my fence, you may call me a fool. Until then, I will be a neighbor, not the kind that brings you pies, but the kind that refuses to let your fear do all your thinking." The drover laughed in that short way that throws a challenge without using the work of grammar. "And what if the posse from the next county rides through with questions? You'll hide him under your bed." She felt the urge to flinch and did not. "I will do what I have done since I buried my husband," she said. "I will decide what happens in my house." A woman near the front coughed into her handkerchief, the dry cough of someone who has been swallowing compromise for years. The council conferred shoulder to shoulder, voices like bees behind a wall. It did not take long. "Fear is efficient when given a deadline. 1 week, the elder said, and tried to sound generous. "On conditions. He does not enter town. He pays for what is given him. He keeps to the boundaries of your land. If there is any trouble, you bring it here before sundown, not after." She opened her mouth and felt the temptation to bargain down the humiliations. She closed it. The price of 1 week was not measured in dignity, but in breath. She nodded. The pastor tapped his fingers on the pulpit, a quiet benediction he did not dare make loud. When she stepped out of the church, the afternoon had already warmed into a promise it could not keep. The sky did that washed-out blue a person can't look at too long without blinking, and dust had begun to lift in little whirls along the road. She bought honey with coins that felt like they had more mouths attached to them than the one she tended. The shopkeeper slid a bottle across to her, the way a man offers a gift to a stray dog, cautious, ready to snatch his hand back. "For the cough," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "I'm writing it in the ledger as lamp oil. Don't make me a liar." "Make yourself a man instead," she said, and her voice was too soft to be a knife and somehow cut anyway. He flinched. Then he nodded in the way a person does when contradicted by something they had hoped to forget existed in other people. Chenoa was in the yard when she returned, not waiting at the door, but in the open where a hawk could mark him, where anybody on the road could count the number of steps between him and the threshold. He had stretched a new line on the well and lashed it tight with knots that looked simple until a person tried to untie them. He had set a bucket under the eaves to catch whatever else the sky might remember to offer. He had not entered the house more than the width of his shadow. She held up the bottle and did not smile. "A week," she said. He did not ask the price because he trusted she would name it if he needed to pay more than his hands could cover. "A week," he answered, as if the word were a promise both could stand inside. In the next days, the ranch learned a different rhythm, not new exactly, but altered. The mule regarded Chenoa without the performative suspicion animals use on men who lie to themselves. He took the harness apart and rubbed the cracked leather with tallow until it drank half its age away. He walked the fence line with a careful eye, not shamed by the need to lean close to find the place where 2 wires had become 3, where rust had eaten a small song into the staple. He did not talk as he worked, not even to fill the space with the noises men throw when they want to be congratulated for effort. He treated the fence with the same quiet respect he had given the fever. Learn its rhythm, then fix it without scolding. Beatriz watched without pretending she wasn't watching. She made the kinds of small tests that do not look like tests unless someone is looking closely. She left her husband's hammer on the sill to see if a stranger's hand would assume rights to another man's tool. She set the feed sacks where only a back already acquainted with labor would choose to lift from. She left the shed unlocked and the photograph still face down under its dust. He touched none of it without first letting his gaze find hers in the doorway. When he did pick up the hammer, he set it back with the head turned away from the edge so it would not mark the wood. It was such a small consideration that her throat tightened and she had to swallow twice to say nothing. At night, he sang. The songs were not meant for show. They kept time for the slow work of recovery, the long distance between a rough breath and a regular one. Some melodies reminded her of wind making decisions in the canyons. Some had the plain assurance of the pump handle's squeak. The baby, who still had no name in her mouth because names, she had learned, invited grief to make plans, settled into those songs as if they had been designed to hold him, as if the particular pitch of a father's low voice could coax the lungs to behave. She realized one evening, watching the child's chest rise with a more confident metronome, that her hands had stopped hovering. They simply rested, palms on the blanket, taking in the warmth like sunlight through cloth. On the 3rd day, Chenoa found tracks by the north pasture. 2 men on small horses had ridden close, dismounted, and paced the fence as if measuring it for failure. He read the sign without the drama of revelation and brushed out the prints with a dry branch. He did not tell Beatriz until he saw the moment when the information would serve her and not scare her into the wrong kind of action. When he did tell her, he offered nothing more than what the ground had said, not the guess of names, not the heavy myth of enemies who grow larger the longer you look at them. "They'll come again," she said. "Yes," he said. "Because they want to be right," she added. "Because they are afraid," he corrected gently, and she accepted the correction because it served a strategy that did not end in blood. He kept his distance from the road. He kept his shadow off the church house even when he rode past to the creek to fill the skins for the ditches. He returned every borrowed thing before anyone discovered it missing. When she sent him to the far shed for the rusted auger bit, he did not shop the shelves with his eyes, as if to see what else might be worth his curiosity. He took the bit and returned with it wrapped in a cloth he had torn from his own kit, so his palms would not add sweat to the metal. Sometimes, in the slow hour after the midday heat begins to let go, he told small stories to the baby he held. Beatriz heard them through the open window while she shelled beans at the table. He told of a creek that had a bed of stones the exact color of the inside of a chestnut, of a hill where lightning struck so often the grasses grew in a circle as if they knew the rules before they were born, of an old woman who could tell weather by looking at the flight of ants. He never said the words mother or wife. He never said the word dead. He did not have to. The sentences found their own way around the hole and did not fall in. On the 5th day, when the child's cough returned in the evening, as if to assert that progress is not a staircase but sand, Beatriz felt the old panic sharpen. It reached for her with the quick hands of a memory that did not know it ought to stay in its room. She pressed a cool cloth to the small ribs and counted again, the numbers not quite lining up with her breath. Chenoa's hand entered her vision, bringing the cup, steady as a shoreline. He did not say it would be all right. He did not trespass on the ground where certainties should not be planted. He hummed the river song and waited. The cough loosened, pulled away, left something nearly gentle behind. She almost laughed then, absurdly, because what she felt was embarrassment at how fiercely she had nearly asked for assurance from a person who had none to give. She glanced at him, and the glance contained an apology he did not require, and a gratitude that made him shift his weight in the chair, like a man who has found a coin where he expected only dust. He spent one afternoon with the shovel and the ditch lines, working with a patience that looked like stubbornness, only if you had never lived in a place where water misunderstood you. He deepened the angle by the cottonwoods and set a stone just so to slow the flow and give the grasses time to think about drinking. Beatriz stood with her hands on her hips, the way her husband had when he wanted to look more certain than he felt. She tasted the old habit of bristling when someone rearranged what the dead had made. She let the taste sit on her tongue until it changed into something else. Not betrayal, not replacement, but continuation. The ditch found its new rhythm with a sigh that had been caught in the earth a long time without a name. She nodded once, small enough to be mistaken for dust in the eye. He saw it anyway, and nodded back, offering credit to the soil and the tool, and the day before he took any for himself. The pact between them did not sit on a shelf or in a ledger. It lived in the way he slept by the door with his back against the jamb, in the way she left the second plate near the stove without calling anyone to fill it, in the way both of them resisted the town's desire to make everything a spectacle. News traveled because news is water in a drought. People slowed their wagons near her fence to see if they could catch a rumor with their eyes. They saw a man in the yard, bareheaded, mending a hinge with a deliberateness that made mockery look small. They saw a woman on the porch with a child in her lap, rocking as if time were a fabric she could smooth with the heel of her hand. Perhaps some of them saw something else and did not know how to fit it into the stories they preferred to carry, a strange calm that grows not from safety, but from exactness, the rightness of each person doing the next necessary thing without asking the world to applaud. That night, when the moon came up bruised by smoke from a fire on a distant ridge, Beatriz found herself standing in the doorway with a cup she did not recall pouring. She watched Chenoa trace hide with a bone awl, mending a cradle strap he had brought out of his bundle, the only thing besides the child and the knife that seemed to carry old life into new. The motions were practiced and plain. The song he hummed was not plaintive. It had a seam of mischief running through it, and when she realized the melody made the baby's mouth curl in sleep, as if dreaming of laughter, it shamed her a little to remember she had not made a sound like that in months. She asked his name in her head, and noticed that it was the first time she asked it not as a label affixed to a problem to be managed, but as a marker on a road she might walk beside. Chenoa. A name like a bird you could hold without bleeding if you knew how. She said it once, in the empty kitchen, just to test how it felt in her mouth. It did not break anything. It did not summon the council or the drover or the posse. It made the room feel wider. On the 7th morning, the church bell rang again, slow and insistent, the way bells toll when they want attention from those who prefer to pretend their ears aren't working. Beatriz set the child in the cradle they had cleaned and mended together and stood watching as the baby wove a hand through air like stitching light. She felt the week like a garment she had been wearing without thinking, and now it was time to see if it fit other people's eyes. She moved toward the door and found Chenoa already there, as if he could read the way a bell moves through a body. "They will want to be right about me," he said, "not bitter, only accurate. They will want their fear to sound like wisdom." she said, as if they could share small fictions as well as large truths. "And you?" he asked, quiet, because the difference between presumption and hope is measured in inches. "I want the child's breath to keep making that soft sound," she answered, "and for my house to continue as a place where doors open when they should." He stood aside, making space first with his body, and then, she realized, with his will. He would not be the problem in the room if he could help it. He would be the proof. The pact had been written in 7 days of small skill and smaller songs. It would need rewriting 100 times in the weeks after if they were lucky. For now, trust lived where it always begins, almost too small to see unless someone is looking very closely, there in the place between a woman's breath and a man's steady hands, in the sound a fever makes when it has the good manners to step back a pace, in the note a rope sings when it is new and knows it will not break today. By the 8th morning, the ranch wore a new habit of quiet, in which small kindnesses grew and were immediately tested. People who intended to mind their business found themselves pausing at the fence to watch for a glimpse of the man whose presence let them name their own unease. Those who had always minded other people's business took longer routes just to pass the gate and leave a word that sounded like neighborly advice and felt like a stone in a pocket. Beatriz returned to town for the bottle the shopkeeper had promised to mislabel, and found him with his ledger already open to the page where good intentions go to be amended. He would not meet her eyes this time. The bell over the door rang and did not settle. Behind the counter his fingers worried a pencil until it splintered. "Laudanum?" she asked, straightforward as she could make it. Words are less likely to draw blood when they don't dodge. "Out," he said too quickly. And then, trapped by the speed of his own lie, he added, "And even if it weren't, I can't, not after the talk. The drover came by, said I'd be keeping raiders alive with good Christian tincture, said he'd take his custom to Marrow Creek if I kept on making exceptions for grief and stray causes." He swallowed, and his Adam's apple bobbed like a man watching a fishhook disappear down his own throat. "You know I got daughters, Beatriz." "Oosh, you had them yesterday too," she said, not unkindly, but the sentence landed as if she had set down a bowl too hard on a thin table. "Yesterday you wrote lamp oil in your book, and I thanked you for remembering your mother's hands." She did not raise her voice. The men at the Cracker Barrel had to tilt their heads to hear, and in the tilting they learned something about the weight of the head itself. "Yesterday," he said, and there was the whole of his defense. The word made a small, apologetic bow toward the door, where the world, messier, more insistent, stood waiting with its hat on. Beatrice could have begged, could have offered the little she had of coin and pride. She did neither. She let the refusal make its home in her, not as bitterness, but as information. As she turned to go, a woman by the window lifted her chin in what might have been a greeting in another life. Here it was, a measurement. Beatrice passed close enough to smell the starch in the woman's collar. The bell announced her departure with a cheerfulness it did not feel. On the walk back to the ranch, a boy on a dun pony loped alongside for a stretch, face split with the satisfied daring of someone trusted with errands for the first time by men who would deny it later. He kept glancing at Beatriz as if the light had to pass through her to strike the ground. Then, with the ceremonial solemnity boys give to cruelty when they are still teaching it to themselves, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a smooth stone, pocket-worn, selected, and flung it toward the ranch road where Chenoa was visible, mending a gate hinge. The arc of the stone was ugly only if you cared about arcs. It struck the hinge and nicked off, struck Chenoa at the collarbone with a sound like a knuckle tapped against wood. Chenoa did not look up. He steadied the gate with one hand, tested the new bite of metal, and went on. The boy waited for the shout, for the chase that would make him an outlaw in the safe, exciting way. He got none. The pony, bored by the absence of drama, tossed its head and tried to crop a weed. The boy made a face meant to resemble a man's contempt and found instead a child's grief. He kicked the pony and moved on, not faster but away, which is a speed people learn to measure with their backs. Neighbors arrived with chicken eggs and warnings. Doña Pilar, who had known Beatriz's mother in the language of shared recipes and deathbed vigils, stood with her shawl thrown over one shoulder like a general weighs a mantle. "They are meeting at the far corrals," she said without preface, because preface is for good news. "The drover who lost the Sutter's cattle, Caleb Rusk, the one who drinks his bitterness like medicine, he's calling men to ride nights. Says a town that sleeps is a town asking to be robbed. He says a woman alone doesn't know what danger looks like until it's moved into her kitchen. Rusk has never been a guest in my kitchen," Beatriz said, and the composure of it burned the back of her mouth. "He thinks danger always wears the face he tells it to. He thinks the last thing he failed at is waiting in every shadow," Doña Pilar answered. "That's how some men keep from naming their mistakes. They give them costumes and then shoot at anything that fits the size." She set the eggs on the table and slid her eyes toward the cradle. The child slept with his mouth open, hand curled around the rag ribbon that had been Beatriz's second-best apron tie. Even sleeping, he made the tiny, effortful noise of lungs that had not yet memorized air. "You have 1 week from the council," Doña Pilar added. "Rusk and his men are not bound by it. They never signed their names to anything but each other's rage." Chenoa listened from the yard, where he was teaching a length of wire to take a shape it did not want. He received the news not with flinch or threat, but with the deepening of that inward quiet that made his choices into clean lines. He memorized the names, even if he would never say them. Every plan he allowed himself grew from a single root. Does it keep the child alive? Every branch he pruned was cut close for the same reason. Heat gathered like a conspiracy. The pasture browned as if shamefully. The mesquite leaves curled into the shapes of small fists. By noon, the air shimmered above the hard pan, and a person could make mistakes just looking across it, could swear a horse was a black stump and a stump was a waiting horse. The canyon wind, summer's usual trickster, came late each day like a friend who has learned you will forgive him, and it tasted not only of dust, but of something sharper, the hard, acrid promise of a brush season a single careless spark could set to marching. Beatriz walked the ditch lines with a stick that had been her husband's, pointing where silt had gathered to make lazy the water's attention, showing Chenoa where the ground held memory. Here, after the flood 10 springs back, we had to lift the line. See the faint seam? We tacked a tin plate to the post then, and sure enough, under lichen and patience, the tin glinted dully. A brief sun caught in shade. "There," she said, "if you set a stone, the water rests and doesn't run like a fool into the swale." Chenoa did not correct or improve as she spoke. He filed the knowledge and let it become his hands naturally, as if it had been there waiting for him to arrive. When she took him farther, down a trail she had never walked with any soul, whose absence wouldn't be a loud announcement, he understood what she was giving. The path narrowed under chaparral. A pair of jays scolded like old friends offended by the hours. She moved a fallen branch, then another, then put her palm against a rock as if asking permission of someone who lived in it. The rock released a thin music as water moved behind it. She led him around the shoulder, where the hill wore its shawl of stones loosely, and there, behind a scrim of grass bleached to a saint's hair, a spring beaded from the seam where earth and the idea of earth stopped pretending to be separate. "I never showed this to him," she said, and he knew she meant the man whose tools still leaned against the barn, whose ghost sometimes sounded like a hinge. He would have wanted to pipe it, and I wasn't sure I trusted the pipe. It would have made the water loud to other people. I wanted it to whisper. Chenoa crouched, cupped his hands, and brought the water to his mouth with the careful gratitude a person uses when he knows a gift is watching him accept it. The sip cooled his teeth. His tongue learned a new geography. He washed his wrists the way men taught by elders do when they need to lower their heat without lying to their bones. "This will save us this summer," he said, not as prophecy, but as a statement of physics and will. "You saved it by not naming it to anyone who would have wanted to own it." She watched him watch the spring, the way he stood between it and the path by habit, as if the first danger any good thing faced was being noticed by the wrong eyes. That was how he treated the baby's crib at night, placing his body like a gate no one could take offense at until they tried to pass through. The days grew barbed at the edges. In town, the men at the corrals polished their plans with the rough cloth of gossip until the plans shone mean. Rusk was the kind of leader that fear makes bright. He turned his face to catch the torchlight and called it vision. He rode up and down the main street at an hour designed to be seen and told grieving stories back to the people who had lived them, changing the endings so he could be the man riding in to fix the part he had altered. A pale sheriff from the next county stopped twice at the church to share news of an ambush that had left 2 deputy badges in the dirt and a whiskey bottle with a ribbon of army blue on the handle. In the telling, the bottle became more soldierly and the ribbon stiffer, until some men felt they would be cowards if they didn't sleep with their boots on. Against that, the ranch offered its homelier testimonies: a hinge that did not screech for the first time since widowhood, a rope that no longer creaked in the exact way a memory does, a ditch that carried water all afternoon where it used to lose hope by noon. Beatriz found that her shoulders had learned to drop a fraction when she saw Chenoa's shadow on the yard. It embarrassed her, the relief, as if she had allowed herself a luxury her ledgers would not permit. She punished the embarrassment by adding tasks to the list, then forgave both by crossing off 3 at the end of each day, whether they were done or not, as mercy to herself. At night, when the child slept, she would catch herself standing a long minute at the door, the same door she had opened to him, and watching him coil rope or oil a strap, the humble monastic ablutions of a man preparing for the next day rather than rehearsing the last one. On the afternoon, the wind changed and brought the smell of someone else's fire, a neighbor boy. That same dun-mounted courier of borrowed bravado rode past with his eyes hardened by a ritual too big for him. He slowed at the fence where Chenoa was cutting sash cord into leads for the goats, slid one hand under the other to make his posture older, and said, "They're riding tonight. Rusk says law don't drive at night, so we have to make our own. That man there best be gone when we circle back, else we sweep." Chenoa raised his head, but did not straighten all the way, as if signaling that no one owned his spine, but that he would not use it to club a boy. "You should tie your pony's cinch," he said. "You'll lose your seat if you try to look ferocious and the saddle slips." The boy flushed and started to flare, then looked down to where indeed the cinch hung in an indiscipline that would embarrass a cavalryman. He tightened it, angry at his own animal. "You don't tell me," he muttered, but the edge of childishness in the grammar made his lips wobble. "They say you killed men." "I have buried more than I killed," Chenoa answered, and the simplicity of it made the boy's eyes slide away. No boy wants to be given the arithmetic of consequence when he has come to collect a myth. He rode on, saddle secure now, and hated the security because it had come from the wrong mouth. Chenoa watched him go, marking the time it took for the dust to settle. He did a calculation he had done before on other ground, in other dangers. How long to pack, how long to disappear, how much water to cache, how to leave a trail that pulls anger away like a willow branch dragging light from a pool. Every sum ended in the child's breath. Every sum removed the word leave and put in its place live. That night, the baby's fever came back the way old grievances visit on holidays. Smiling at first, then staying too long. It rose fast, a trickster returning with new jokes. The skin at his chest tugged hard at the ribs. A false calm glossed his eyes. The air itself felt meaner, as if heat had grown claws. Beatriz remembered the bottle not bought, the excuse crafted into policy by a man with a pencil, and her jaw set in a way the storm would have respected. She bathed the child's limbs, spoke the little words that keep a mind from walking into its own confusion. Chenoa stoked the stove not for warmth, but to boil the water in an endless chain that would not allow itself to be interrupted by fear. He sang the river song, and then the one that sounded like a coyote laughing at the moon. even as it grieved the day. When the fever did not buckle, his hands went still. Stillness is louder than any shouted plan when a person's nature is movement. He stood, the motion quiet as a decision not to disturb a sleeping wasp, and reached for the bundle he kept ready, the knife, the strap, the roll of dried meat that could pretend to be strength for a day. Beatriz saw it the way women see a man packing the kind of mercy that will break a house. "No," she said, and the word had the weight of a gate slamming before a flood. "If I run the ridge," he began. "You will run their fear right back to this door," she said. "You will make a trail out of yourself that leads straight to his breathing. They will say the man fled because he was guilty, and they will be eager to prove themselves right with rope or bullet or the old miracle of neglect. Do not give them a parade to march in. Stay. Staying makes you their target," he said. He had not intended to say you. The pronoun jumped out and made him human in a sentence that was supposed to be strategy. "I have been a target most of my life," she answered. "Of kindness I didn't ask for. Of grief I didn't order. Of advice dressed as love. I am still here. What I have not been, not for years, is part of a we. Do not take that from me when I have not finished using it." He looked at the child, and in the curve of a tiny ear saw the woman who had died in brush dirt with blue cloth scattered around her like the pieces of a lie. His plan, to draw the hunters away, to be the coyote that fools the dogs by fixing their eyes on his own moving shadow, had the hard, satisfying geometry of self-sacrifice. It would make him noble and leave her safe, he told himself, and in telling, he exposed the vanity hiding in the selfless shape. He felt the idea crack. He felt the older, more demanding truth step through, that sometimes safety is not a matter of where a body is, but of what a body refuses to abandon. "Stay," Beatriz said, and this time it was not an order. It was a plea crafted by a woman who had sworn not to beg and learned, tonight, that begging for the right thing is a form of courage. "I cannot do the work in this room if I'm listening for your footsteps leaving it." "Rusk will ride," Chenoa said, as if invoking the drover's name would make it smaller. "Rusk will ride whether you stay or go. Men like that ride because riding disguises the sound of their own thoughts. Let them meet a stillhouse, let them meet a man holding a baby and a woman holding her ground. Make them choose to be who they are with witnesses." He did not know how to stand still and found that he wanted to learn. He set the bundle down as if someone might be sleeping inside it. The relief that broke across his chest felt like defeat, until he understood that some defeats rescue more lives than certain victories. He returned to the cradle and pressed his thumb lightly against the soft spot on the child's head, not with fear, but with the reverence of one who knows the safest place in the world is also the most vulnerable. The fever peaked in a flurry that took the whole room to contain. The walls leaned in, the window darkened with a wind that had come to listen. Beatriz spoke to the child in Spanish, and then in the private dialect of those who have sat at too many bedsides. Chenoa answered in a tongue that made the air low and generous. They moved in a choreography that belonged to older people who had survived longer grief, and yet here it was, borrowed for two who were still learning each other's edges. The child's body shuddered, then shivered, then found the shiver that calms instead of alarms. Sweat came, the good sweat, and they both felt it under their palms at the same time, like a bell rung once for joy in a town that had forgotten how. Beatriz laughed then, a laugh without sound that used the whole of her face. And afterward she cried without tears, the way a cloud releases its weight as shade. Chenoa sat back on his heels and realized he had been leaning forward, as if the will in his bones could reach the fever and reorder it. When the baby slept, the house did not exhale so much as re-inhale the world, letting it back in new pieces, each inspected for harm. They did not light the lamp. The dark was not their enemy tonight. In the quiet, they could hear men far off at the corrals, voices carrying, as bravado always does, higher pitched than courage, filled with the inventory of guns and reasons. Between those voices came another sound, nearer, the crackle of the pasture as dried grasses rehearsed disaster. The smell of smoke was not from their yard, but it was a smell that turns all homes into one. Chenoa rose and paced the room once, the step of a sentry committing to watch without pretending watchfulness will be enough. He stopped by the face-down photograph on the mantel and, with the permission of the room's new grammar, lifted it. The man in the picture stared out with the complacency of someone who had not yet been told his life would end in a breath stolen by a fever no one could bargain with. Beatriz watched Chenoa's face as he looked, and the fact that he did not wince or act as if he owed this stranger an apology made something in her unclench. "He dug the first 2 ditches wrong," she said into the dark, because to speak of the dead only in nicknames of praise is to make them too heavy for the living to carry. "He thought water obeyed intentions." "Most men do," Chenoa said, setting the picture back with the glass wiped by his sleeve. "Water obeys path. We can shape path." "Teach me what you know," she said, and understood as she said it that she had folded more than irrigation into the sentence. He nodded in the dark, because the dark felt like a friend who would not tell stories out of turn. "Tomorrow," he said, "we lay a scarf of bare earth along the fence line. We teach the goats new boundaries. We set a backburn line where the ditch meets the arroyo, so the fire has to say please before it crosses." "Tomorrow," she echoed, not because she was tired of today, but because she had just survived a tonight and wanted to name the winner. They did not speak of Rusk again that hour. They spoke of tangibles that would keep gratitude from becoming superstition. The baby snuffled, the sound as sacred as church bells on a wedding day. Chenoa, without thinking, said, "He laughs in his sleep like his mother used to when the old woman made a joke about birds listening to secrets." It was the first time he had given Beatriz a piece of the woman's life that belonged to delight and not to death. He realized he had done it only after Beatriz's mouth made a shape he had not seen on it before, something like a home finding a window. Outside, coyotes debated etiquette. Farther off, a hawk called the last note of its argument with the day. The wind turned and forgot again what it had come to say. Beatriz went to the doorway and stood in the threshold, the place where all decisions practice walking. She felt the old vow come and take its place beside the new. "I will not bury another loved one, and I will not let fear make my choices for me." Beside them, both came a recognition that surprised her because it did not feel like surrender. She cared whether Chenoa breathed tomorrow. The fact arrived and found a chair and sat. Toward midnight, a lantern winked across the pasture, then disappeared. A firefly too large to be believed. They listened without inhaling, counting heartbeats between the sweep of light and the absence of it. A horse snorted, hooves scuffed, then held. Rusk's ride, or one like it, circling to see if fear had the shape they had been promised. Chenoa stood not to go, but to stand where anyone looking in a window would see a man unserpented, unarmed in his hands, his weapon the ordinary presence of someone who had chosen to stay. Beatriz did not move away from the cradle. She placed her palm on the baby's back and felt the lift, the fall, the lift again, the reliable proof of resistance. The lantern hesitated, then went on. Perhaps they had not seen what they had come to hate. Perhaps the dark had been kind to the truth for once and hidden what would excite the wrong men. Perhaps even men like Rusk have wives who sometimes tell them to come home, and sometimes those wives are obeyed. When the sound drained from the road, Chenoa let his breath go as if he had held it for the town. "I would have run," he said into the room, "because honesty tonight was the only currency worth anything. Not for fear of them, but because I still think I can fix danger by becoming it." He faced her. "Not all the way, but enough. I told myself it was to keep you safe. I see now it was to keep myself from needing anyone. That is not the same bravery I thought it was." "You are learning," she said, and the sentence offered to a grown man might have shamed another. To him it came as permission to keep standing where he had chosen to stand. The hours slid by, each a rung on a ladder they had agreed not to climb too fast. When Gray rinsed the window, the baby woke with a noise that did not hurt to hear. A breeze came from the west and for a minute smelled like rain instead of apology. Beatriz untied the door latch and let the morning in. In the yard, the world revealed the evidence of heat, cracked ground, leaves turned the wrong way, a low nest of tinder by the shed where she would not have chosen to keep it if she had been a woman without yesterday's tasks. Chenoa stepped past her with a bucket and a list he had not written. He would clear the nest, cut a corridor of bare earth, move the wood, tie back the brittle sage. He would walk the fence and feel the wires as if they were strings on an instrument he was learning to play because someone had put a child in his arms. Before he reached the well, he paused, turned back, and offered a sentence without fancy to the room that had held their worst and given it back better. "I will not leave, not by night, not to be noble. If I go, it will be with your word or with the boy's breath steady enough to argue with me." "Then go fetch water," Beatriz said, because love at its smartest shape often looks like practicality, and she had work, and he had work, and between the two lay a spring that whispered where to find them both if anyone got lost. By midweek the sky forgot to blink. Heat laid its hand on the land and left it there, and every living thing learned to move slower inside that hand. The ditch lines murmured with the stubbornness of water that refuses to quit, even when it is misunderstood. Chenoa lifted a clod from the trench wall and crushed it between his fingers. It gave up in powder and drifted away on a wind too tired to deserve the name. Behind him, the infant dozed in the shade of the rigged muslin, the small sawgrass of his breath finally regular enough that a person could walk away and trust it would still be there when they returned. Trust is the rarest crop in a dry country. It must be husbanded, not spent. The trader came toward noon in a cart that announced itself with dangling spoons and a tin star nailed to the axle as a joke. He had a face like a dried apple, creased, sweet, unexpectedly resilient, and an accent that collected vowels from wherever he had slept last. His horse wore a hat of flies, and no complaint about it. He was the kind of man who made a town believe it was on the map, simply by visiting. He waved before he reached the gate, not to prove his hands were empty, but because he wanted the gesture recorded in case the conversation ahead of him needed that evidence. "Lady Beatriz," he called, "and the gentleman who looks at rope like a teacher looks at chalk. May a poor traveler peddle a few solutions and one problem?" He stopped short at the yard's edge, where the soil changed from packed to friendly, and tipped his hat to the cradle without apology for the sentiment. "Speak," Beatriz said from the porch, the single word, both invitation and boundary, because once you've let a rumor into your house, it is difficult to get its boots off your table. He reached under the bench of the cart and brought out a wrapped package the size of a man's heart. He placed it on the barrel top between them with the care of someone who knows the value of theatre and of its opposite, good tincture. "Laudanum enough to make a doctor jealous and a preacher doubt his calling," he said. "Paid for by a woman in Marrow Creek who gave me eggs when I had only stories, and who said to send this where a child's cough is being stingy. I chose you because no one in this county can stop talking about your front door." Beatriz felt the room behind her tilt on its hinge. Gratitude came in hot, ashamed of its need, and she made herself meet the trader's eyes so the feeling would not grow crooked. "What do you want for it?" she asked, though everything about his posture said the price had been sorted by someone else's generosity, and her dignity would not be taxed. "A pitcher of water," he said, "and a true telling. News is the only coin that increases in value when you spend it." She brought water in a chipped jug that had survived 3 summers and 1 fall from the counter that would have broken a stronger vessel. He drank with the showy restraint of a man who has learned that gushing invites mockery. Then he bent closer, and the joke fell off him like a shawl. "There's a posse riding out of Dean's County," he said, tone made for rooms where people do not want to be overheard by their own fear. "Sheriff with a mouth too young for his badge. They're hunting an Apache raider they say has been waylaying freighters, stealing army tack, leaving blue scraps on thorn and branch like flags for fools to salute." The way they described him, tall, hair tied back with leather, a scar like a river branch down the left shoulder, a quietness that makes men talk too much when he walks by. Well, he glanced respectfully at Chenoa, who had not moved except to place himself with an instinctual precision between the trader's line of sight and the infant's cradle. "Well," Beatriz heard a sentence the trader did not speak. "If I were a lazy storyteller, I would say it was you." She also heard his refusal to be lazy. Her neck felt the eyes of the town in absentia. She could sense their pleasure at how neatly story and suspicion could be made to fit. "Men who dress in uniforms they did not earn have been busy this season," she said, because saying it aloud keeps it from becoming too heavy to carry in silence. "And men who need a villain prefer him simple." The trader shrugged with a weary kindness. "The road makes all kinds of men," he said. "I have seen bandits pray, and deputies steal, and preachers teach a horse to dance for money. I've also seen a woman sit by a bed through a fever that would have sent a soldier back to his mother's mud floor." He tapped the package once, like a benediction. "If the posse asks their questions here, they will not be asking after the truth. They will be asking after the relief of finding their fear a home." Chenoa lifted his shirt enough to show a ragged seam of scar, the wrong shoulder. He did not do it to absolve himself. Absolution is not a currency he believes in. He did it to insist on particularity in a world that prefers silhouettes. "Left," he said simply, and let the shirt fall. "Truth is stubborn," the trader agreed. "But men are often more stubborn than truth." He looked toward the horizon that smudged where smoke had been walking. "Sunday is coming. That drover, Rusk, is telling chorale stories, as if they were scripture. He will want the church. Preachers hate saying no to a crowd. If you have anything that needs saying back, say it where the rafters can remember it. The roof leaks in the south corner." He added the last, as if to prove he meant to leave them with something more useful than omen. When he rolled away, the cart resumed its bells and cans, as if to reassure the afternoon it was still a place for small commerce. Beatriz watched the dust settle and wanted to believe in a town that could absorb a gift without demanding a receipt. She took the package inside. The bottle within was the size of a man's mistake and twice as potent. She set it where she could look at it without it looking back. The baby slept on, both hands open, moss-soft, as if holding nothing were the first step toward holding anything. Word travels on horses and in breadlines and between women bending over the same washboard. By nightfall, the county could have drawn the wanted man's face from memory, and it would have looked like 3 different people, each more likely than the last. Rusk's voice rode in front of his body the way a rooster's shadow arrives before dawn. He paced in front of the saloon with his thumbs hooked in his belt and narrated old griefs as if they had been waiting for his mouth to give them permission to exist. "You give a man like that a week," he said, "and he takes a season. You give him a season, and he takes your daughter's freedom to walk down the street without counting how many steps to the nearest door." Men nodded because counting steps is a woman's work, and they were glad someone else had promised to do it for them. Sunday was a white dress with a tear under the sleeve. Children fidgeted in their best shoes, and women fed the stove's mouth in the back room so coffee could accompany comfort. The pastor had rewritten his sermon twice, and still did not know which sheep in his flock were wolves, and which wolves might yet be taught to prefer berries. The pews filled with the usual absences, men who had to check a fence, women who could not find clean grief to wear, and with unusual presences, riders from Dean's County whose horses wore their arrogance in the set of the bit. The sheriff among them was smooth-cheeked and pinked by the habit of fresh shaving. His deputy's badge sat on his vest as if it had been pinned there by a woman hoping to love him into caution. Rusk stood near the front and looked back often, like a man who needs the sight of his audience to believe in his own sound. He caught Beatriz's arrival with a smile he had practiced in mirrors that never asked him to bring water. Chenoa came with her, not staying at the door as a shadow this time, but stepping into the aisle, into the room's most public air, where people could decide what to do with the fact of him. Conversations faltered. A coin dropped from a child's hand rolled under a bench and hid, as if ashamed to be a witness. The pastor began with a psalm about the valley of shadows, which felt unhelpful. He meant well, and men who mean well sometimes do not remember that women walk the valley daily with baskets and do not have time to admire its topography. He was 27 and sang in the evenings to a mother who had become too small for her bed. He loved his people and dreaded them in equal parts. His hands shook when he turned pages because so many of the edges in his life were made of paper. Rusk rose with a gentleman's apology and no gentleman's patience. "With respect," he said, which is a phrase people use when they plan to withhold it, "we have law sitting among us from Dean's County, and we have had wrongs done to us recent enough to taste. Are we going to pretend that trouble hasn't moved into a house we all can name? Are we going to pray rain into a dry ditch, or are we going to speak plain? Plain sounds righteous when men choose who gets to define it." Beatriz felt the room tip toward Rusk like iron filings toward a magnet. She tasted her own hesitation and found it had the flavor of old shame. She had learned to keep the door closed on days like this, to spare her heart the spectacle of men playing with matches in a drought. Today, she had a different duty, and it was not only to the child snuffling in the crook of her arm, or to the man who had taken to mending hinges as devotions. She stood before she could argue herself back into safety. The sound her shoes made on the aisle floor was a small sound, the kind that rooms learn to hear if they have a conscience. She turned not to Rusk, but to the row of women who held the church together with pies and blankets and unsung trains of casseroles. "He stood in my yard the night the ember storm came," she said, and the room leaned closer because everyone remembered that night, how the sky had looked like a curtain catching. "You remember? Lightning miles off, and then the sudden wind carrying little fires on its back. A strip of grass turned into a fuse that ran at my barn like a boy daring his brother. He took a shovel and cut a line through brush and root and rock while the wind tried to teach his lungs a lesson. He did not ask me if I had a right to keep cattle. He did not count how many of you had said his name like a threat. He cut the line, and the fire met it and stopped to think, and in the time it took for fire to remember it was mortal, we saved what could be saved." She did not look at Chenoa while she spoke, because the truth did not require witness to be true. She looked at the pastor, whose hands had steadied somewhere between page 3 and 4. She looked at the shopkeeper, who could not meet her eyes, even in a pew. She looked at Doña Pilar, who gave the small nod only old friends can give when they see a woman decide to grow taller in a room that would like to keep her small. Rusk laughed, short and sharp, substituting noise for argument. "A shovel won't change a man's nature," he said, "and a man's nature is what we're discussing. That sheriff brought a description in his pocket, and it fits fine enough to tailor a noose." The sheriff stood then, unprepared to be a prop, and miserable about having to be a man. He read from a paper he had folded and unfolded so many times the fibers had leaned toward tearing. The hair, the scar, the height, the quiet. He did not read the part about the baby, because it wasn't written. Men who wrote descriptions rarely included how a man held a child, and this one held one as if every bone were a prayer he could help finish. Chenoa did not move to disprove, did not point to his right shoulder, did not offer to disrobe before an audience hungry for a show of any kind. He did a more dangerous thing. He walked to the side door that led to the churchyard, pushed it open, and stepped out into the full discipline of daylight. The loaded pause he left behind him was not bravado. It was an invitation for men to decide whether their courage was heavy enough to follow a man into the simple work of repair. The south corner leaked, everyone knew it, and no one had quite prioritized it above the more entertaining leaks in other people's character. He set a ladder under that corner and climbed, every rung a decision to remain visible when invisibility might have bought a week. He reached the eaves and ran his hand along the shingles like a man greeting a horse. The wood was split, the pitch brittle. He tucked his shirt up, tied it with a leather thong to free his arms, and began to work. The hammer music landed in the sanctuary like a second sermon. Some took it as insult. How dare a man accept our sacred air and then replace it with the vulgar meter of labor? And some took it as rescue. Here was someone turning talk into roof. A child in the back pew tugged his mother's sleeve and whispered, "He's fixing," with the awe children reserve for verbs that matter. Rusk tried to continue his speech and found that his sentences had to shout to compete with a man aligning a shingle so the next rain would be caught properly. The sheriff's deputy craned his neck to look through the side door, and, on the altar of his gaze, something small and holy happened. He smiled. It was involuntary, the way a body acknowledges competence without consulting the mind. The pastor, seeing that smile, found his own back. "We will have testimonies when the roof is whole," he said, and though the phrasing made Beatriz want to correct his theology, the meaning held, "Speak later, let the work teach first." Beatriz felt heat climb her throat in an old, familiar panic, the body's treacherous reminder that visibility has a cost, and then something else rose to meet it. A steadiness she recognized as the missing half of so many decisions she had faked her way through since widowhood. She understood in the space between hammer blows that her defense of this man, practical, unadorned, was also the first stout defense she had offered to her own right to expect more from a day than survival. If she could say aloud that his courage counted, then she could say aloud that the small hope unfurling in her like a fern was not a trespass, but a tenant with papers in order. She did not smile. The moment did not ask for it. She breathed differently. That was enough to mark a season turning. Outside, a wind devil strolled down the street and shook flour from the air like a housewife snapping a rug. Two of Rusk's men stepped out to spit and squint and failed to look brave in daylight's impatient honesty. The shopkeeper's daughter, a slip of a thing with bruised shins from climbing where she'd been told there was nothing to see, slipped out the side door with a dipper of water and stood below Chenoa's ladder without ceremony. He came down halfway and took the dipper and said thank you in a voice that made the word heavy enough to matter. The girl blushed not with romance, but with the startled pride of having done something admirable in a room where men had been making admirable difficult. When the roof corner was patched and the patch washed with a bucket as solemn as a christening, Chenoa climbed down the last rung and stood in the doorway, not entering, not asking to be feted, simply making himself available to the room that had spent a year preparing not to know what to do with him. The hammer hung at his side like a kept promise. The sheriff folded his paper into a square too small to read and put it away. He did not retract his posse. He did not absolve or conclude. He did what many good men do at a midpoint they don't yet recognize as such. He withheld his worst. Rusk saw his grip on the room loosen and lifted his voice to catch it. "A shingle won't give you back stolen cattle," he barked. "A roof won't keep out a knife in the night. You people going to forget what you've lost because a man can swing a hammer." His eyes found Beatriz's and tried to make her flinch. "You going to make him a saint because he happened to be standing where you needed a back? Saints make poor husbands," he added, and the word husbands landed with a thud the room pretended not to hear. Beatriz did not grant him the satisfaction of a blush. She addressed the women again, because men should not be trusted with the only votes that matter. "I am not asking you to change your minds," she said. "I am asking you to change your attention. Look at what is in front of us. A roof that does not leak. A child who breathes easier. A man who, when given a choice between hiding and contributing, chose the latter. If you cannot bless that, then you have decided to bless nothing until it is yours, and that is not faith. That is stinginess dressed in scripture." A chuckle, dry and appreciative, came from somewhere near the stove. Doña Pilar, not bothering to hide her amen, crossed herself like a woman co-signing a loan. The pastor lifted his hands over the room and discovered that for once he did not feel ridiculous. "Let us be wise enough to recognize courage in plain clothes," he said, "and fearful enough to ask it into our homes." When the service ended, people left in knots of argument and in pairs of relief. Some shook Rusk's hand with the fervor of men who needed their fear fed, and some shook Beatriz's as if the contact would prove they could still feel something like decency move through their skin. The sheriff paused at the threshold, cleared his throat, and managed the smallest of retreats. "Ma'am," he said to Beatriz, "if that raider comes by your place and you see fit to tell me, I'd be obliged." It was not a joke. It was a man practicing the art of not knowing everything. Outside, the heat pushed sweat into everyone's eyes impartially. Chenoa looped his hammer through his belt and began to collect the nails that had skittered into the grass. Because waste is another kind of insult, he refuses to deliver. A boy, perhaps the same who had thrown the stone and not yet learned the ratio of regret, edged near and offered awkwardly a square of bread his mother had pressed into his hand when she saw the roof being mended. Chenoa accepted and tore it in two and handed half back. The boy blinked, unsure if he had just been made equal or tricked into generosity. Equality is a trick boys are not often taught to recognize as the prize. He took the bread and ate it with the kind of solemnity that makes a boy a man later without him noticing when. Beatriz lingered by the side door and watched all of it, the way a roof can repair more than itself, the way a woman's sentence can move a room while a man's shout only shakes it, the way a child learns by accident. She understood that her stand had changed something fundamental and that the next weeks would come to collect on that change with interest. The posse would still ride, Rusk would still convene darkness, but the map had acquired a new road, and it led through her. She had asked herself for courage and had been surprised to find she could afford it. By late afternoon, the shadows grew longer, as shadows always do after the bravery of noon. Beatriz and Chenoa walked home along the ditch road, saying little, because some victories are cheapened by commentary. The baby slept in the sling against Chenoa's chest, breath misting the leather with a humidity that felt like the promise of a forgotten season. They stopped by the secret spring and took its temperature with their wrists. It was still the same cool word whispered by rock to water. Beatriz touched the stone that kept the trickle honest and weighed her decision to show him this place against the world's hunger for taking. She found that she would make the same choice again and again, and in that finding, she read her own character with a kindness she had not afforded herself when she was busy surviving alone. On the ridge above the road, 3 riders tilted like punctuation at the end of a dangerous sentence. Rusk was not among them. He preferred his theater with more chairs. The men watched without dismounting, the silhouettes of those who measure the day by the number of small tyrannies they have accomplished before sundown. Chenoa saw them and did nothing to shape his stride to their gaze. He understood now that leaving in daylight would say a thing he did not mean, and staying in shadow would say a different thing he also did not mean. The right statement was work performed where it could be witnessed by those it served and those it irritated. They reached the yard and found on the porch a gift none of their planning could have conjured, a jar of elderflower cordial, and under it a note written in a steady hand that had baled more hay than letters. For the cough. No name. Some decencies prefer anonymity. Beatriz held the jar against her cheek and felt it cool her skin the way a word like mercy cools an argument when spoken by the right mouth. Inside, she set the cordial next to the laudanum and the honey, a lineup of options from harsher to kinder. She found herself hoping to use the kinder more. As evening sloped toward the hour when families speak softer, Chenoa filled the bucket and carried it to the bare earth scarf he and Beatriz had started along the fence line. He poured and tamped and poured again, and in the lulls between, he sang something new, still low, still rivered with patience, but brighter at the edges, like light grating off mica. Beatriz paused in the doorway and listened, and understood that the song's brightness did not deny the night that would come. It simply insisted that the day be counted, that its courage claim its rightful space before fear came with its ledgers. She thought of what she had said in the church, of how her words had defended him, and by a silent doubling had defended the idea that her life might yet contain not only work and grief, but astonishment. It embarrassed her to name it thus in her own head, so she named it in pieces, that she might laugh at supper without apology, that she might let a hand brush the back of her neck and not wear dread for an hour afterward, that she might look at the horizon and think tomorrow instead of maybe never. These possibilities were not native to the land she tended. They were introduced species, but some introduced species become the only shade in a summer like this. She decided to plant one and see if the goats left it alone. When dark finally came, it brought with it the rattle of men practicing bravery at a distance, the test rides, the drunken whoop that wants to sound like a threat and lands as insecurity. The posse's campfires spotted the hills like the measles, and with the measles comes a fever that can break or break you. In the house, the baby stirred and coughed once, twice, then settled with a sound that belonged to neither death nor drama. Beatriz put her palm on Chenoa's forearm in a gesture that felt large, because it was the first time she had let touch earn its way past the door she kept for herself. He did not move, as if any motion would make the moment skittish. He simply turned his hand until his fingers could hold the back of hers for the length of a breath and then another. Outside, the wind rehearsed for a future fire no one wanted, and everyone knew they might have to meet. Inside, two people and one small life arranged themselves around the knowledge that courage had been asked for and given in public, and that the price of it would arrive soon. Between the ditch and the door, between the roof and the spring, between the word raider recited like a prayer and the word father still learning its shape in a man's mouth, a line had been cut that afternoon, clean and true. When the flames came, and they would in one form or another, they would have to stop there and consider their nature before they crossed. The day began with the plain, manageable arithmetic of survival. Water drawn before light. Goats walked to the bare earth scarf he and Beatriz had widened along the fence. The baby fed and drowsed against the shine of morning, and ended with a calculus no ledger can bear. Somewhere between the two, a man who could not bear becoming unnecessary made himself useful to fear. He had been in the church that Sunday, standing at the back with his hat pressed flat, as if obedience could make a circle into a shield. His name was Reeves Calder in the ledger, but in town he was the man who always knew how to arrive where the story was being told and add a detail that made him relevant. He was the first Beatriz had hired after widowhood to replace a broken gate, and the hinge he set had mourned every rain by squealing like an old sorrow. When Chenoa mended the south corner of the church roof, when he aligned the shingles with the calm that made competence look like grace, Reeves felt the rooms of his usefulness shrink. He had been the man people called when they wanted something to hang together just long enough to forget they'd asked. Now a stranger's quiet had made that kind of work look like a trick played on the desperate. Envy found in Reeves not a home, but a broom closet, cramped, hot, barely room for a man to turn around. And in that space, envy learned to whisper instead of shout. He watched Chenoa walk down the ditch road with Beatriz afterward, the baby layered in cloth against the pennies of sun falling through the cottonwoods. He watched the easy way the mule followed, the casual trust of an animal that forgives a human's past by reading the current hands. What struck Reeves most was not the spectacle of gratitude being earned by labor. It was Beatriz's posture. She no longer carried her shoulders like a barn beam across a flood. They had lowered, not in surrender, but in the simple acknowledgement that there were now two backs strong enough to share the weight of an ordinary day. That sight had the power of a miracle to Reeves. The wrong kind, the kind that makes a man choose to bruise it so it will not bruise him. So he rode to the saloon early the next afternoon and found Rusk pouring his anger into other mouths. Rusk brightened when Reeves took off his hat like a supplicant. People like Rusk love petitions. They turn them into proof. "You want a story?" Reeves said softly, the tone men used to share secrets that were always public. "I got you one. He's got a spring." She showed him. "Out there behind her back pasture where the hill splits. He's hid stashes there if you ask me. I seen him carry bundles that are too heavy for baby cloth. Weapons, maybe. Army steel. He's got the look of the kind that keeps his arms close so they don't clank. Rusk's eyes lit the way oil does when it finds match. You seen the weapons? I seen the bundles, Reeves said, and envy finished the sentence for him. Because men like Rusk do not hire verbs that cost more. You ride at dusk. He's out there most near the evening to wash things. He'll be there. A man is not a reliable witness when speaking about his own importance. Reeves could not see that the bundles were the cradle strap and the rags Beatriz boiled to chase fever, or that Chenoa's posture was born not of clanking steel, but of a lifetime of making himself small in rooms that were eager to fill with other people's nerve. Rusk did not care. He heard spring, and his mind conjured a cache because water is treasure, and in a drought men forget that mercy has more uses than bullets. The afternoon grew mean and long. Heat curled the paint on doors and made dogs dream of caves. Beatriz soaked linen until the water gave up its clarity, hung the cloth in the shade, then washed the basin as if cleanliness itself could be made to stand guard. Chenoa packed the backburn line along the ditch with new dug dirt and showed Beatriz how to read the wind by feeling where the hairs on the back of the hand stir first. The baby slept with his mouth open just enough to make a whistle. Each time he exhaled, Chenoa felt his own ribs answer, as if the tiny bellows had apprenticed his lungs. They went to the spring near evening, when the sun's cruelty becomes almost courteous. Beatriz moved the stones with ritual economy, the way you lift the coverlet off a sleeping thing you love. Water winked in its crease and breathed on their wrists. She set the child's shirts to soak and pressed soap into the cloth with her thumbs until the lather looked like new weather. Chenoa filled skins, laid them cool against the breeze, and listened to the birds recalibrating their nests for a night wind. He heard hooves and stiffened in that small internal way people learn in country like this, to send the alert to the bones first, to the face last. They were 3 at first, then 5, then 8, the count of a bad idea gathering friends. Rusk led, wearing his temper like a sash. Reeves hung back, face pale with the terror of his own act, which flared and died into satisfaction when he saw that yes, there was a spring, yes, there were bundles. He had not lied to himself. He had misread. Misreading is a man's favorite mercy to himself, when lying seems too brazen. Rusk swung down before his horse had stopped moving and strode to the water with the idiot confidence of someone who has never been kept out of any room he wanted to enter. He kicked a cradle cloth with the toe of his boot and let disgust show. "Look who's made himself a fort," he said, loud enough so his men could borrow his opinion. "Piles of, what, linens? Hiding your knives under baby shirts, are you?" "Hiding nothing," Chenoa said. He did not glance at Beatriz. Their safety had become a duet, and to look would be to set the tempo for the wrong song. Water for the child, for the ditches. You want to drink, drink. You want to accuse, do it in daylight with your hat off. "You've been doing a lot of daylight lately," Rusk said. "Climbing roofs, trying to teach us about charity by nailing it to God's house. You made a fool of me in front of people who prefer a hammer to a rifle when their roofs leak." "You made yourself," Beatriz said before she knew she would. He only fixed what needed fixing. Rusk's mouth did the quick curl of a child denied a biscuit. He jerked his chin. 2 men waded into the trickle with their boots, stirred mud until the spring's clarity clouded, then pulled out a diaper, a tiny shirt, a rag of cloth with a ribbon sewn awkwardly at the corner. The ridiculousness of the objects found should have humbled them. It enraged them instead. Men who came to prove a villain cannot abide the moment when evidence refuses to dress in the costume they brought. "Mocking us," one spat. "Hiding behind women and babies." He turned the wet shirt in his fist until it squeaked. "You thinking we won't do what's needed because you hung laundry on your crime? Take your hands off that," Beatriz said, stepping forward with a steadiness that told even the rocks what they were meant to do. "There's a bottle in my kitchen that can make a cough stop for a while, and there's honey that can make it less cruel when it returns. That shirt has the smell of both. You'll put it back." Something in Rusk snapped at her calm. He had come to stride through fear as through high grass, and here was a woman pressing a hand to his chest without touching him. He could not swing at that and still call himself righteous. So he did what men like him always do. He picked a smaller target and called it strategy. He nodded, and two of his riders peeled away and cut across the nettle-thick path toward the yard. "Don't," Chenoa said, the single word, the most dangerous thing in the world when spoken by a person committed to gentleness, because it means gentleness has teeth if you insist. They did not obey. One reached the house in 20 hard heartbeats and pushed through the open door with the casual violence of certainty. The other turned his horse broadside at the yard fence and watched the porch as if watching were a form of ownership. Beatriz knew without seeing that the cradle sat by the cool spot she loved, the jar of elderflower cordial catching light like a yes. Chenoa moved, and the world watched a man invent a new restraint. He could cross the space between him and the rider in a blink and pull a man from a saddle so fast the dust would not have time to rise. He could throw Reeves into the spring and hold him there until Bubbles surrendered their calendar of excuses. He could take Rusk by the collar and show him the floor of the world. All of that would feel like a lesson well taught. It would also turn the child's breath into a measure of his rage, and that calculus had one answer. So he cut his own impulse at the root and let it fall like a tree prepared months before for this storm. "Come back," Beatriz shouted toward the house, voice leaving her like a hawk's shadow over noon. "Come back, and I will give you what you came for." His consent to leave this land for a day and a night. That should have been enough for any man who truly believed he was doing hard arithmetic in the service of safety. It was not, because safety was not the math here. Humiliation was. The rider in the doorway re-emerged with the baby held rough, not cruel yet, but on his way to it. The child wailed once, offense, not fear, and then hiccuped into silence, reading the weather of the arms that held him and thinking, the way children are forced to think too soon about what to do when arms forget their promise. The sound Beatriz made then had no English in it. It came from a place mothers and widows share, an organ the body hides for emergencies. She moved toward the rider like a woman who had told God already what the cost would be and had not heard a counteroffer. Rusk stepped in her path, then away again, surprised by his own cowardice, and in the opening she reached the horse's flank and set one hand on the baby's shirt, the other at the rider's knee. "Give him," she said, and the boy on the horse, because he was a boy once, under all that bailing twine of arrogance, flinched at the command and would have complied if not for the second rider's laughter. Pride leaned down and hissed in the boy's ear, and the boy did what boys do when they are trying to sound like men. He squared his jaw and made a mistake. He jerked the baby back. The movement was not vicious, it was simply ignorant of scale. Something in Beatriz flashed, not anger, not indignation, a kind of survival she had not needed since she'd wrestled fever out of a bed with her bare will. She placed her hand flat to the horse's shoulder and pushed exactly where a person trained a horse would push, to ask for one step aside. The horse, confused into obedience, obliged. The rider lost balance, snatched at the child to correct the error, and instead of easing, tightened his grip. A hand flew out, not the rider's, Rusk's, and in the chaos of sudden correction, it struck. It struck where Beatriz's name lives, in the cheekbone, in the pride, in the catalogue of remembered slights she had practiced ignoring. It sent her down into the dirt, with the child slipping just out of reach, a distance too theological to make sense. Chenoa did not see red. He saw Beatriz in grey, the chalk of dust on her brown skin, the ash of road gathered into the lines at her mouth, the swing of her hair as it caught and then fell. He saw the baby's eyes squeeze shut and then flare with the starburst confusion pain makes in small bodies. In his chest, something ancient and large stood up. If rage has a voice, his said nothing. Quiet rushed through him. Not absence, but the concentration a hunter gives to a single leaf to know if deer have moved it. He crouched inside his body like a man making himself smaller in a storm so the roof will not lift. Then with deliberation that looked to some like surrender and to a few like the scariest kind of power, he lifted both hands and opened them to the air. "No," he said to his own impulse, to Rusk's expectation, to the boy's hunger for spectacle, to the old lives that wanted him to prove a point with blood. "No." He sank to his knees so no horse would rear. He laced his fingers behind his head, a posture that made the men around him breathe easier and made Beatriz want to tear the sky open with her teeth. "Let her up," he said to Rusk. "Give the child to her. I will go where you tell me." Rusk blinked. Men who expect to be fought are always a little lost when offered the thing they came to take. He nodded at the boy, who had gone green as boys do when they unintentionally bruise something small and precious. The boy leaned down, and Beatriz reached up, and the handoff felt like a ritual older than this county. Two people restoring right order despite every wrong encouragement. She held the child to her like an oath and did not look away from Chenoa, as if looking away would give someone permission to erase him. "Bind him," Rusk said, grateful to return to the marching rhythm of orders. Reeves watched with an expression like the thin shadow a kite makes when it has climbed just past control. He did not want to see the string that tethered his actions to outcomes. The men bound Chenoa loosely at first, as if the spectacle mattered more than the security. He stood when they hauled. He had already decided standing had to be his to give, not theirs to take. And then the road did what the road has always done in stories. It delivered another problem on wheels. The Deans County posse arrived in a spatter of dust and righteousness. The young sheriff sat straight as a rule, the badge on his chest cleaned with the care boys use on toys when they have been told they are not toys. His deputy's mouth was set to apologize by reflex and readiness both. They took in the scene the way men trained to think in lines take in a tangle. They spotted the man on his knees and the ropes and decided a problem had sorted itself and required only a signature. "Well, look here," the sheriff said, relief audible as gratitude mispronounced. "Neighbors doing the work a county budget won't stretch to. We'll take him off your hands, gentlemen, lady." He tipped his hat at Beatriz without seeing the flint in her eyes. "This'll save us a search of 6 washes and a canyon full of lies." "He's ours," Rusk said, possessive as a boy with a frog in a jar. "He's been plaguing us and making the women soft-headed with his roof patching." The deputy frowned, unoffended by the incongruity. "Is roof patching a crime in these parts now, Mr. Rusk?" "It is when a man like that uses it to make fools of decent folk," Rusk snapped, and to his credit the deputy looked almost delighted by the lazy illogic. The sheriff, eager to keep momentum, waved Rusk's argument away like cigar smoke. "No need to split hairs. The description matches enough, we're obliged to inquire. Tall, scar on the shoulder, quiet like a cat. I'm not saying he is the man we want. I am saying I'll sleep better if he's in a cell tonight." Beatriz stepped forward. She had the baby in one arm, the bottle of cordial in the other hand, because she had grabbed it without thinking when Rusk's rider turned her house into a stage. Her cheek flushed where the slap had made a flower bloom. "He is quiet, like a man who listens," she said. "He has a scar on the right shoulder, not the left. He has a child who learned to breathe around his songs. He has a name. Say it before you take him." The sheriff had a mother who taught him the decency of names. He obeyed without realizing he was obeying. "Name? Chenoa," Beatriz said, and the cadence she gave it made a few heads in the crowd tip the way they do at a hymn they have never heard and somehow know. "What's it matter?" Rusk cut in, already tired of the sound of a woman's intelligence. "You want him or not? We got fences to ride." What mattered was that the town council had begun to appear, one by one, the way men gather when they sense the chance to officiate without taking responsibility. The elder among them stood with his hands behind his back in the posture of jurists and cowards. "Sheriff," he said, we appreciate your assistance in this matter. There have been complaints, tensions. A woman's kindness has, while admirable, complicated the optics." He cleared his throat, embarrassed less by his mealy mouth than by the fact that it had not tasted power in a while. "Our week of mercy is, well, nearly done. Perhaps it is best for all concerned if the law takes its course. Fear wears a suit well when the tailor is a council agenda. Policy is the word men use when they want to place their terror outside themselves and congratulate it for being impartial. Beatriz felt the peculiar chill that comes when a room of neighbors decides to behave like a document. The pastor stood near the porch with his hands in fists he had never used. He opened them and stepped forward one pace, the distance of a man who has never wanted to be in anyone's way and finds himself in everyone's. "We had an agreement," he said, voice steady enough to pass for more than it was. 1 week. 1 week to tend a child. It is not sundown on that week. It is sundown somewhere, Rusk said, pleased with the wit not because it was clever, but because it let him stay loud. "Sheriff, you taking him, or am I finding a rope worth theology?" The sheriff flinched at the word rope, not because he was a saint, but because he had seen what rope does to a man's face and had not eaten well for a month afterward. "We'll take him," he said. "Ours will be the neck on the line if it's the wrong man. That's the job." He nodded to his deputy, who dismounted and cut the rope binding Chenoa's wrists, only to replace it with his own leather, tied tight and official, as if the law is better at knots than hatred. Chenoa stood when they lifted. He did not look at Rusk. He looked at Reeves. In that look, Reeves saw the small, clean ledger in another man's eyes, envy debited, consequence credited. Reeves wanted to say he had meant nothing by it, that he had not predicted this end, that he had been provoked by roofing jobs and laughter he was not invited into. He wanted to say, "I didn't think." He did not, because the only man who might have listened had been tied like a lesson. "Wait," Beatriz said, "because there are words a person must try, even when they have less chance of success than dew at noon. If you take him, you take a line of water with you. You take the man who cut fire from my barn and who could teach you to keep your own roofs. You take the father of this child, whether you write it down that way or not. I have given him a week, and I will not pretend I gave it grudgingly." The elder councilman lifted both hands in the despairing palms up of bureaucrats. "It is out of ours now," he said. "We must respect jurisdiction. We must." Beatriz repeated, tasting the word as if it were medicine offered without label. She stepped back because she had no right to pull a man out of the law's hands with strength she did not own. The baby cried, one long, pure note. Chenoa turned his head half an inch toward the sound and then back again, not because he did not want to look, but because looking would write something on his face that men with rope love to read. The sheriff tipped his hat and did not meet Beatriz's eyes. The deputy did meet them and looked ill. "Ma'am," he said, "I can't promise anything except that we'll do the job right." She nodded, because fussing with courtesy in that moment would mock her own intelligence. Rusk searched the faces for satisfaction and found less than he had counted on. The sight irked him. He pointed at the spring as a way to reclaim the script. "You'll not use that without permission," he told Beatriz, as if water grew loyalty to men who carry guns. "Not until this is settled." He swung into his saddle with the grace of a man who believes his back is a banner and wheeled his horse toward the corrals to gather applause. When the men marched Chenoa toward the road, Beatriz moved to the edge of the porch and made herself memorize everything the hour was made of so she could spend it later like a currency. The dust halo rising from his boots, the notch cut in the heel of the deputy's left spur, the way the sheriff's hat brim dipped like a promise he could not keep, the jar of cordial on the sill, catching sun and making of it something you could pour, the mule's ears flicking forward, back, forward again, trying to calculate the meaning of a rope on a good man's wrists, the secret spring whispering in the distance as if water had its own opinion no one had thought to ask. She memorized, too, the posture with which Chenoa left, upright, not stiff, accepting, not broken. A man who had made the choice that would keep a woman on her feet and a child breathing long enough for the next act of courage to find its time. She had thought once that the opposite of love was hatred. Watching his back recede down the road, the rope a thin, indecent line between his hands, she understood the opposite of love is drift, the lazy letting go, the consent to whatever weather arrives, the lie that says passivity is innocence. She had been a master of drift since the day a fever made her a widow. It had kept her alive in the way a cold keeps meat from spoiling, useful, but not a life. Standing on the porch with the child's weight proving gravity, she felt within herself a new heat that had nothing to do with the weather. It embarrassed her to name it in her head. She named it anyway. Love, first and trembling. Not the thunderclap kind, but the desert kind. The type that puts down roots in unlikely rock and says, I will look like nothing until the day you are burning, and then I will be the only shade. The council drifted away, talking in their careful voices about procedure and not about the bruise darkening on Beatriz's cheek. The pastor lingered, clumsy with a compassion that had never yet had to leave the room where it was born. He will need a witness, he said, apologizing to the heir for the presumption that he could be that. He will need someone to tell how the spring holds only water. He will need more than words, Beatriz said, but start them. She did not soften it to please him. Men who offer prayers need sometimes to be given verbs. Doña Pilar appeared as if she had unfolded from the shadows, a basin in her hands that had seen childbirth and grieving and soup, the trinity that keeps a town from becoming a rumor. She knelt and washed the dirt from Beatriz's face as if washing were a sacrament and not just a cleaning. You will not sleep tonight, she said, not asking, and Beatriz nodded without courage and without shame. The sheriff's dust settled on the road with the quiet of a man closing a book on the chapter he does not understand. Rusk's men flung a final look at the spring, the way boys do when they are leaving a thing they hope will burn without their tending. Reeves lingered in the last of the light as if it might bleach him clean. Beatriz lifted her head and looked at him, and he flinched because her gaze did what law had failed to do all afternoon. It measured him against himself. She went inside, set the baby down, fed him, listened to his brief complaints as he worked the world back into a tolerable shape, and felt the minute he forgave existence for its rudeness. She put the cordial on the shelf next to the laudanum and touched neither. Then she took a scrap of paper and a stump of pencil and made a list, because lists are one way to turn panic into plan. Rags to the spring before dawn, she wrote. Speak to pastor. Find the deputy's name. Ask Doña Pilar for the cart. Hide nothing. Hide nothing was not a task, but a posture. She wrote it down anyway, underlining it because grief loves disguise, and she had decided to shame it by calling it dressed. Outside, the land tightened, as it would, and wind rehearsed the cruel theater of flame, as it had promised. Inside, the house rearranged itself around a new grammar. Every object now whispered, "Act." The ditch sang a thin song under the cottonwoods. In another county, a cell door would swing on its hinges, and a man would learn the mile of steps in its width. On a porch at the edge of the hard country, a woman who had finally said yes to her own future set her palm to the wood, as if checking its temperature, and found it warm, not with heat but with the friction of intention. She had thought mercy was the absence of harm. Tonight she learned mercy is a series of choices. She added another line to her list, do not mistake patience for passivity. And then, because she had fed the child and needed to feed the part of herself that plans revolutions with bread and vinegar, she ate standing by the window and watched the road, neither in hope nor in despair, but in the stubborn, ordinary way people who intend to change it learn to watch. Night came on like a verdict the land had been trying all day to reach. Heat loosened its grip by inches, not mercy but fatigue, and the wind changed its mind as often as a liar in church. Beatriz waited until the sound of the sheriff's horses died into the long hum of road, and the house had finished telling her what was missing. The baby fell asleep with his fist open on her shirt, a clutch relaxed by exhaustion rather than trust, and in that loosened grip she felt the measure of what the night would cost. She did not give herself time to weigh it against a safer arithmetic. Safety had left with the dust. She kissed the soft place just behind the child's ear, where even grief lowers its voice, and wrapped him in the blue blanket that had once been a skirt and once before that a curtain that tried to keep summer out. She lifted him and carried him into the darker part of the yard, where the cottonwood wrote its tired signature against a scar of stars. Doña Pilar had said she would sit up, and the promise stood now like a lamp in a window. The old woman's house leaned into the road as if it had been listening all afternoon. When Beatriz knocked, the door opened before her knuckles found wood. There are rooms that learn the rhythm of need. This was one. A basin steamed. A prayer lay folded by the stove like a shawl. The old woman took the baby without commentary, the way midwives take a life as if it is both miracle and job. She placed him in the straw-lined drawer that had been pressed into service for grandsons and kittens, and one lamb born too early and lived anyway. "Go," she said, voice a rasp of chamomile and years. "You have made your list. Now make the world read it." "I am asking," Beatriz said, and the words startled her because she had trained her mouth for years not to shape them. "I am asking the night to give him back." Doña Pilar's mouth softened with the memory of her own hardest bargains. "Then you have already left the country of despair," she answered. "Return with a man in tow, or return with a plan to shame the ones who took him. Either will do for a dawn." Beatriz set a palm on the baby's chest and felt the tide of breath move under her hand, a small sea refusing to learn the word stop. She tucked a strip of cloth that smelled of both honey and laudanum near his cheek, and the child turned toward it with the greed that makes mothers proud and frightened in equal parts. "If I do not return before sunrise," she said, and the sentence tasted like brass, "bring him to the pastor. Make him a sanctuary out of a leaking roof." "He will be a sanctuary by then for us all," the old woman murmured and crossed herself, and then, breaking her own rule against excess, crossed Beatriz as well. "Now go." The saddle remembered her weight. The horse flicked an ear as if to say "you" again, and then set its shoulder under her with the willingness of an animal that has forgiven human foolishness for a century. She tied a wet cloth around the bit to keep the mouth quiet, tightened the cinch twice with the knowledge that the second pull always reveals the truth, and slung a coil of rope and the shovel Chenoa favored across the saddle in place of a rifle. She did not own a rifle that would change any mind she needed to change tonight. She packed a small jar of ash to blacken her cheek and the backs of her hands. In country like this, the wind reads paler skin as a signal. She slipped the pouch of nails left from the church roof into her pocket. Tiny insurance that a man riding hard in the wrong direction might have to slow down and reconsider, and tied a braided strip of cloth to her wrist, a habit from a younger woman who once believed talismans could stay the hand of weather. She set out north along the ditch lines. Water tells the truth if you ask in its language, and Chenoa had taught her to listen to the current with her wrist, not her eyes. The ditch led to the lateral to the creek to the river canyon that the sheriff's horses would be forced to follow, because every road in this county, no matter how grandly it begins, must eventually bow to stone and pass where water has allowed. She leaned low at the places where the wind tossed seed heads into rattles, and she read there the direction of hooves not by their prints. Hardpan had baked them into hieroglyphs, but by how dust had laid itself down afterward. It is possible to learn a language in a week if you have nearly starved for it for years. She had. Memory rode pillion and did not ask permission to speak. The last time she had crossed this piece of earth at night, it had been behind a wagon with a white sheet tied along one side, where a sheet had no business being except to shade a man who shook as if someone were reading him too fast. Her husband's breath had been a coin that rolled back and forth on the lip of a table and refused to choose a side. Fever had made him beautiful and terrible, eyes bright with argument, hands reverent with hallucination. She had spoken in the even voice you use with skittish animals and men who do not remember your name in the moment they need it most. She had asked nothing then. Her jaw had set in that punishment of women who are competent. I will not burden the world with my wanting. The world had accepted the easy excuse and taken her husband anyway. It had left her with a ranch and a door and a set of shoulders that forgot the grammar of belonging. Tonight, she asked, almost under her breath, as if the land had become an old landlord she might yet cajole. She said it in pieces that made it simpler to mean, give him back. Give me 1 hour of luck, and I will pay it with a year of work. Give the boy a morning that contains his father's voice. She felt silly, and then she felt the exact opposite of silly, which is not solemnity but usefulness. She diverted east to lose any shadow she might have been growing, and came up behind the councilman's house, because cowardice, when it roosts, chooses eaves over trees. He had been the one to say must earlier, the one who dressed fear in the clothes of policy to save himself the trouble of owning it. Light still showed behind the lace curtains. Men sleep poorly when they have signed a neighbor away. She slid from the saddle, tied the reins in a single slip-knotted loop Chenoa had taught her, easy to free without light, and walked into the yard as if she had been invited. Dogs tested their consciences and found them lazy. They did not bark. She stepped into the kitchen without knocking and let the door's small groan announce her. The councilman's wife started and pressed a hand to her collarbone with the reflexive grace of someone who would rather lay down her life than raise her voice. The man himself looked up from a ledger as if he had been posing for his conscience and had not expected any audience but his own excuses. "We are not taking visitors at this hour," he said, discovering too late how ridiculous the sentence sounded in a county where night comes like a guest who knows your address. "You have the description," Beatriz said. She did not seat herself. Chairs offer men a chance to opine. "Read it to me exactly and then say where Rusk takes his private justice when he thinks the law will embarrass him." The man blustered first. Men do, and found the wind had left him. He fumbled for the paper, the one the sheriff had unfolded and folded until the fibers learned despair. She watched his lips rather than the words. Tall, scar on the left shoulder, hair tied with leather, riding army tack, stripped of insignia. Quiet, wrong shoulder, she said. "You saw it yourself when Chenoa mended your roof after the last hail, but you were too busy admiring your own hospitality to notice. Right shoulder jagged as if a river cut a new channel, and his tack is stitched rawhide, not regulation. The thread tells you a mother taught him to save rather than to strut." "Say it," he swallowed. His wife watched the exchange with an expression Beatriz recognized, envy mixed with complicity. The wife had been translating for this man for years, and here was someone speaking in declaratives. "Right shoulder," the councilman conceded, and the room let out a breath that had not belonged to it. "The tack," he faltered, and then, cornered by truth and a woman who would not move, did something that might grow into courage if watered. He owned a fact out loud. "It doesn't match. I knew it didn't, but once a paper begins to read itself, it prefers not to be interrupted." "Where," Beatriz asked again, "does Rusk take a man when he forgets that tomorrow exists?" The councilman's eyes flicked to his wife. Her jaw tightened. He looked back at Beatriz and named the place as if he were telling her where a well had gone bad. "The old toll bridge at Deercut. He says law is slower than a river and twice as prone to wandering. He'll hang a man there and call it a boundary." Thank you," Beatriz said, and meant it less for his words than for the way he had allowed himself to see them. She turned to go, and his hand fluttered in a little helpless gesture that asked for absolution. She gave him the only kind she esteemed. "Tell the pastor what you just told me," she said, "with your chest open, not your ledger. Put your must where your mouth was." "Il deal." The road to Deercut lay like a vein across the land, pulsing with the main current of fear that had been moving all season. It threaded low through sage and up into broken rock, where the river had once argued its way across a shelf and been denied. The bridge was half timber, half memory, its planks kept more by habit than by nails. Men liked it because it felt like a stage, and the canyon turned their voices back at them with a choir's generosity. Rusk liked it because it was far enough from town that a scream had to learn to fly before it could gossip. The narrator knew more than Beatriz now, and the knowledge was a weight that wanted to tip her horse's step. In the scrub above the cut, Rusk had gathered 6 men who preferred action to accuracy and had warmed them with liquor disguised as courage. He strutted the length of the bridge, explaining procedures, and kept getting tangled in his own rope. He held forth on the fine differences between vengeance and discipline, and did not notice that some of the boys with him were there for neither. One wanted to impress a cousin, one wanted to spend the summer in a story he could flirt with later. One simply wanted to see if his stomach could keep down what he had heard men brag about stomaching. The sheriff's camp lay a mile south near the cottonwoods, where a spring made a seam in the ground. The deputy cleaned his gun without looking at it, the gesture of a man not trying to make a tool shine, but trying to scrub an idea from his hands. He had felt earlier the difference between a law made by paper and a law made by the fact of a man holding a baby. He was too new to know what to do with the dissonance. He was old enough to know he would be hearing it in his dreams for a year. Beatriz slid off the road and into the arroyo that ran parallel, stopping where the wind licked grit into little snakes. She undid the wet cloth from the bit and pressed it to her hairline to smell, one last time, the ordinary life she was leaving for the hour. She ground ash over the shine of her cheek and the backs of her hands until she looked like someone the night would recognize as its own. She moved the nails in her pocket so they would sing softly when she ran. Men on a bridge, drunk on their echo, would not hear this small music until their horses did. She did not gallop toward the bridge. She circled to the downwind side because men who stand in the middle of a plank road with their backs to the dark grow arrogant and deaf, but a horse snorts at the scent of a woman who has been a mother and a widow and a worker of gates. Horses have their own politics, and they favor humility. She gave the horse a hand sign to wait and sank to a crouch in the sage, every inch of her body remembering work done in silence when a fever made the walls too loud to bear. She watched. The watching was the hardest work. Most rescues fail because someone cannot suffer one more long minute of looking. Chenoa had been tied to a post that had once held the tollman's ledger. The rope bit his wrists and his ankles. The knot was showy, the kind boys learn so they can perform authority. He had read the bridge's slats and counted the weak ones, and mapped the rhythm of the river's bluff beneath, and felt, minute by minute, the wind inhale and exhale through the cut. Wind does not always move forward. In certain hours and in certain places, it breathes like a sleeping animal. He had waited for the breath that draws in. He knew that was when sound comes toward a body rather than away. And if a person wants to be heard by one listener but not by a crowd, that is when he must spend his voice. He did not spend it on the men. He spent it on the night. He bent his head, and in the exact inhale of the canyon, whistled a tone too low to be anything but a mother's call for a child who climbed farther into a tree than is prudent. The sound traveled backward under the gaiters of sage, fell down the arroyo with the dust, and threaded itself into Beatriz's ribs. She had never heard it before, but she knew it as if she had been born listening. She answered with a smaller sound, a trick Chenoa had taught the baby when sleep would not be coaxed by song. 2 clicks of the tongue against the back of the teeth, a small door opened twice. The canyon ate the clicks. Chenoa felt them anyway. It is possible to hear through bones. Rusk turned to the youngest of his men and made a show of offering mercy, the kind of performance that makes men forgive themselves for what happens next. "Confess your crimes," he said to Chenoa, like a schoolmaster who has memorized sin, but not shame. "Say where you hid the tack. Say who rides with you. Say which army man you cut for that scar." Chenoa lifted his head only enough to keep his neck from thinking it was a surrender. "Right shoulder," he said mildly, and Rusk flushed with the fury of a man corrected on stage. One of the boys laughed a little sound he couldn't swallow. Rusk rounded on him, and the boy turned his face skyward as if the stars might adopt him on the spot. Beatriz threw the first nail and missed on purpose. It pinged the far rail and sang the bridge's tired note. 3 horses shifted, because metal on wood at night says falling in every language. She threw a second and let it skitter under a gelding's hooves. The animals skittered too, a dance half fear, half contempt. The boys cursed. Rusk snapped a leash of words, and the horses read the tension and passed it from bit to flank. She moved closer. She timed her body to the wind's exhale now, when the canyon pushed sound away toward the river, and she set her feet where the sage's shadows were thickest, and she laid her palm on the ground, where a timber along the bridge had driven its fatigue down through the dirt. When the rope creaked as a man tested it, she moved her hand an inch and learned the knot. Men tie what they know. The knot at Chenoa's wrists was a cattleman's loop, tightened by performance rather than by need. She had opened that knot one-handed in kitchens with babies on her hip and in fields when a goat had hung itself on spite. She would open it again in a place where men had been rehearsing tragedy. On the lawmen's side of the river, the deputy rose and started walking as if he had remembered to be the kind of person his mother had believed she was raising. He did the small thing that changes nights. He did not tell the sheriff. He told the cook to fill the coffee. He told the horse picket to check their hitches once more. He told the river his name so that if he drowned in it while doing the work he had been born for, it would know whom to return to shore. Then he cut into the arroyo, less quiet than Beatriz, but guided by a luck that favors the silent intent of a single decision done well. Rusk had brought a rope, not because he intended to use it, but because men like him bring symbols to keep their followers from asking for substance. He swung it in the air because swinging it made him feel taller. The boy, who had laughed earlier, put a hand to his stomach and looked green again, and in the small gap that opened between that gesture and the false solemnity Rusk was trying to radiate, Beatrice reached the pillar where Chenoa's wrists were bound. She smelled dust, sap, the iron tang of a nail rusting beyond use. She pressed her cheek to the timber and touched Chenoa's fingers the way a doctor tests a pulse. A question, not a claim. He shifted his weight exactly as much as he needed, and no more. She slid the blade, small, stolen from her kitchen like a woman steals time, under the rope and noticed how the fibers had swollen with the sweat from his skin. Swollen rope frees slower and cleaner if you ask it with patience rather than force, she asked. The blade whispered. The wind inhaled and exhaled and carried the sound where she needed it to go. Nowhere. Tell me, Rusk said, and shook the coil as if shaking the sky could waken truth. Later, Chenoa said. And the men laughed, because later is the thing cowards train themselves not to believe in. His hands came free with a sigh that the bridge covered by complaining about its own years. He did not move them. Stillness was his weapon tonight. He used it with the discipline of a craftsman who knows he is working with brittle material, a crowd's certainty. The rope at his ankles had learned a different knot, the showy one again, and Beatrice had to slide her body farther into the open to reach it. The wind went dead. The canyon held its breath as if auditioning to be a witness. Beatrice paused. Chenoa did not. He said, soft enough to be a thought, "Wait for the suck." And in that fragment of instruction lived field law, river law, life law that no lawman could counterfeit. She waited. The air tugged at her sleeve. The knife slipped. The knot gave an inch. Rusk threw the rope for drama, and the rope came back and hit him in the mouth. The boys laughed again, fully now, the first laugh of the night that did not taste like sickness. She took that laugh as cover and cut. The fibers popped. She put her palm hard to Chenoa's ankle to keep him from jumping. And he did not jump. He rolled his foot and brought his weight to his heel, a shift invisible to everyone but her and the rope. He was free. Freedom misused is a noise. He made none. He kept his hands behind the post as if still bound and bent his head as if chastened and waited. The art that saves more lives than any rescue, waiting for a good idea to grow teeth. Beatrice slid backward, the sage receiving her like a girl who has decided to befriend an older woman because older women know where the water is. She nearly tripped over the deputy in the arroyo. He froze. She froze. Both recognized something honest in the other, desperation doing its best impression of integrity. Deer cut. he whispered, though the bridge was above them like a verse sung in the wrong key. She nodded. He pointed at the bank under the bridge where erosion had eaten a prayer niche into the dirt. "He can drop here on my count. I will shout about a rattler by your horse. You'll run to calm it. He jumps. You pull him under." He paused, appalled by his own courage. "If we're caught, I never saw you." "If we're caught," she said, "you say you came to stop a lynching. Because you did." Now she wanted to put her hand on his shoulder and thank some woman she had never met for the accuracy she had raised in him, but touch is a luxury in plans like this. She slid past and around to where the bank crumbled, and there she waited, mouth open to hear better, hands willing to become hands not owned by fear. The deputy stood and walked into the open like a man walking into a hot kitchen, with purpose and the memory of pain. "Rattler!" he shouted, honest alarm in his voice. He had seen movement by her horse earlier, the kind of movement snakes and men make when they are weighing whom to spare. "By the mare! Get your mounts back, you fools, unless you want to ride home with a calf's worth of venom in your knees." Boys jump when you give them a reason that lets them keep their dignity. They leapt sideways, grabbing reins, cussing the way men do when they need to be loud to convince themselves they're brave. Rusk cursed the deputy with a creativity that would have won him dinner in a different crowd, and stomped toward the pickets because dominance prefers to act as if all threats are beneath it. In that small chaos, Chenoa exhaled, stepped to the rail, and went over like a man who has spent his life finding the parts of the river that will forgive a body. He fell by inches, as if unrolling himself, hit the bank with quiet, and then disappeared under the bridge where the smell was wet wood and apology. Beatriz reached and found an arm and then a hand. It closed around hers with a claim that startled them both. His fingers were cold, with the kind of cold that lives under skin and has nothing to do with weather. She pulled and he came, and the world did not cry out because the world was busy rearranging itself around the discovery that one man in the road had lost his center of gravity. Rusk turned and saw a post without its lesson tied to it and bellowed. The canyon threw his voice back at him, made larger and dumber, and the horses danced at the sound. They ran bent double under the span, the dirt damp and sucking at their boots, the dark so complete it taught eyes humility. Chenoa led with his spare hand, and she followed, letting the pressure of his palm on hers tell her what the ground would do before it did it. He took the path where shadow pooled because wind had not cleared it, because men rarely look where the world refuses to gloss itself. Above, the deputy's voice went on about snakes and idiocy and the way this county had lost the talent of recognizing what would kill it. Men argued. They always do when they need to keep still. They reached the cut where the arroyo slants into the river like a thought that has been waiting for its sentence. Chenoa crouched, squeezed her hand once, a code he had not taught her and that she understood immediately, and slid into the trough left by last winter's flood. She followed. They moved without speaking now, the way people do when speech would give away what bodies can keep private. Her heart thumped against his knuckles where their hands still joined, and in that rhythm a vow wrote itself without ceremony: "I will not let go as long as there is forward." Behind them, Rusk found his wits and his rage and did the thing cowards do when left with only one choice that does not flatter them. He shot into the dark. The first bullet struck bridge, the second struck old wood. The third made a sound like a plot breaking, a crack, not because it hit either of them, but because the wind chose that moment to inhale, and the noise of fire far off reached the canyon like news that would change the next chapter. The deputy swore and made a spectacle of disarming a boy who had swung his rifle experimental as a child with a broom. "You shoot into a ravine, and the echo might be your own name," he said through clenched teeth. "Hush." They reached the shadowed elbow where the arroyo bent into safety and stopped because exhaustion is as pragmatic as courage. They leaned against rock that had held out its shoulder for 1,000 lesser dramas. He tightened his hand once, as if checking that she was not a trick. She tightened back, neither opened. Names are heavy, they saved them for later. Breath would do. When they finally moved again, it was downhill, the way of water and confessions. At the bottom, the mare lifted her head where she had waited, faithful because horses are skeptical of men, but generous toward women who smell of dust and milk. Beatriz took the reins and brought the horse to her knees to make room for two, and the debt they carried. Chenoa boosted without grunting, and for a second his hands were on her waist and his breath on her shoulder like an old marriage. She had the common sense not to name the sensation while it was working. He swung up behind, the old rhythm of riding double waking in his muscles, as if he had been born to lean over some future he could not yet invent. They did not race. Racing leaves footprints in sound people can follow with their pride. They threaded the sage as the wind exhaled, crossed the creek where it rarely crossed company, and took the ditch road home. Home as proposition rather than fact. At the place where the spring's whisper could almost be heard if you believed in it, they slowed because something in both of them wanted to mark the moment with the land that had suffered their decisions all week. The air smelled of heat, remembering itself, and far off, much farther than the drover's bullets, a line of flame rehearsed its entrance without audience. "Thank you," he said at last, and the words sounded inadequate to both, and holy anyway. "You taught me to wait for the wind to breathe in," she said, a woman praising a world she had once given up on, "and to cut only when the air carries the sound the right way. I had not known patience could be a blade." He laughed then, quietly, and the laugh was made of relief, and something truer than relief, the shock of finding one's life still attached at both ends. He did not let go of her hand, even though both hands were needed for balance and prudence. She did not let go either, even though 1,000 wise versions of herself would have listed reasons. Hands learn faster than minds, and these had been taught too much withholding to let the lesson linger. Behind them, the bridge fussed to itself, and the men on it grew loud to disguise their failure, and the deputy, who would be writing a report in his head for weeks, stared into the arroyo and made the decision that separates boys from men. He chose to be right later, rather than loud now. Ahead of them, Doña Pilar's house held a drawer where a child slept, and a basin where water still steamed, and the ditch line, stubborn and ancient, pointed the way it always had, toward the small, hardened miracles ordinary people make when they stop asking permission from their fear. Lightning did not announce itself with theater that afternoon. It walked in on soft feet, dragging a dry cloud skirted with dust, and touched the ridge as if testing the land for memory. The strike was a single white muscle flexed against a sky that had spent a month rehearsing excuses. Wherever it met the ground, there was, for a heartbeat, silence, then the sound of tinder recognizing its purpose. Flame stood up, like a man shaking off sleep. It licked through brittle grass and took a breath and found it liked what it tasted. The wind chose a direction the way men choose sides at a fight, fast, careless, with a hunger to see something undone, and pushed a wall of fire toward town in a steady, hungry gait. Chenoa smelled it before he saw it. Smoke here had 7 flavors. He knew them, the way a mother knows the different notes of an infant's cry. There was the resin snap of pinon, the papery sigh of sage, the sweet deceptive blossom of willow if a creek bed caught, the sour animal of a hen coop going, the faint metallic edge of wire heating. What came now was the rough spice of mesquite and the whistling scorch of cheatgrass, each blade a fuse. He turned his face to the ridge and felt the heat on his eyelids like a hand pressed there to forbid a truth. In the yard, the jar of elderflower cordial on the shelf turned the light to gold and then to warning. The ditch along the fence whispered in its thin voice, "Hurry." The vigilantes had been gathering even before the storm found its piece of land. Rusk was galled by the failure at Deer Cut. The bridge had returned his voice in a register he didn't prefer, and the deputy's interference had made him feel mocked in front of boys who had been grooming their mustaches in his shadow. Reeves, sick with a remorse he could not admit without losing the story that made him important, had ridden into town early with talk of finishing what was started, and talk is a seed that loves hot ground. They met at the corrals, counting ropes, counting reasons, counting on the sheriff's camp to be just far enough that law would arrive after they had written their version of justice in dust. When the first smudge of smoke showed, Rusk took it as divine punctuation, God himself calling for the page to be turned. Beatriz knew a different divinity. Doña Pilar had put the child into her arms with a soapy kiss on his brow, and Beatriz had held that small weight the way a person holds a letter they intend to answer with a life. Then, the first sharp-edged scent entered the house and made even the baby turn his face and frown. Wind leaned on the door once, the way it does when it has something to say and is choosing whether to use words or force. Chenoa was already in the yard, uncoiling rope, already shouting in the clipped sentences of a man who gives directions instead of speeches. "Backburn," he said. "Now, along the scarf, along the ditch, we starve it of what it loves." Beatriz's mind went to the goats, to Doña Pilar's drawer, to the church roof that had learned to hold. "And the people," she said. "They don't know what to do with a fire that has all the verbs." "You know," he said. It was not a compliment, it was a task. She took it like bread. They split then in that dangerous, necessary way two people must, when saving many things at once. He took the shovel and the torch of oil-soaked rag and rode the ditch line, calling for men who had always wanted instruction to admit as much, summoning boys to the work with the promise of importance that would not hurt anyone. He ran fire along the bare earth scarf he and Beatriz had carved in previous afternoons, the humble revolution of a foot-wide corridor of no grass. Flame ate the crumbs he fed it and lay down where he told it to wait. A dog taught a trick by hunger. He set little ribbons of fire to crawl toward the oncoming wall, and where the ditch met the arroyo, he lit a curve so precise it would break the bigger animal into manageable thought. Beatriz swung onto the mare with the child strapped to her chest, with the cradle strap Chenoa had mended by lamplight. She rode into town not as a supplicant, but as a belle. She took the north end first, the shopkeeper's wife, who had practiced hardness at the counter and softness at the stove. The widow Marisol, with her two boys, who liked to climb the cottonwood and pretend it was a crow's nest. The old teacher, who had eyes like thimbles and feet like blessing. Beatriz's knock did not ask. Her hand on the latch did not wait for approval. "Out," she said. "Take what you can carry that breathes. Leave lies and ledgers. The ditch will hold only if our houses do not make kindling of our pride." People who had spat at her found themselves moving at her command. Competence rearranged their prejudices, like furniture shifted to make room for a stretcher. The shopkeeper tried to apologize for the laudanum without saying the word. She shut him up by handing him a wet burlap sack. "You will lay this along the eaves at the south wall," she said. "You will check on Doña Marta at the end of the lane and tell her she is allowed to accept help today." He went. He was clumsy at first, and then he was good, and becoming good saved him from having to compose a speech. She rode to the church, left the baby with the pastor for the length of a paragraph, and climbed the bell tower. She pulled the rope with the body of a woman requesting not attention, but action, and the bell's mouth opened and poured the right kind of panic into the street. People who had previously preferred gossip to chores heard in that peal a list of tasks and ran not from but toward the work. The pastor, his hands finally given a sacrament they could understand, opened the doors wide, hauled buckets, distributed blankets, tore pews into sledges without asking the deacons. The sheriff's men, seeing the ridge become a brightness no preacher could compete with, broke camp and rode in. The deputy ahead, his hat off, his hair standing in honest confusion. He did not call orders. He asked what was needed, and the way he asked made men tell him. He found Chenoa at the south ditch, face streaked with charcoal, eyes narrowed not with anger, but with calculation. "You know this like algebra," the deputy said, "and the admission of ignorance in another man's expertise is the only form of flattery worth hearing." "Backburn eats," Chenoa said. "Give it the path and nothing to feed on, and it becomes an ally. It will want to jump. We keep it humble." He pointed with the shovel. "There, there. There. The scarf we cut is thin in that run. Put hands there." The deputy put his own hands there first. The sheriff, late but not useless, found himself taking instruction from a man he had tied hours before and felt the heat of humiliation in the same skin the fire was testing. He kept his mouth shut and hitched his horse to a wagon and hauled water because sometimes redemption looks like manual labor. The councilman who had said must earlier found his feet obeying Beatriz's orders without checking with his head, and the head, freed from the duty of pretending wisdom, began to admit facts: right shoulder scar, rawhide stitches, a mother's lessons tacked into every piece of the day. Rusk, who had ridden to town with a rope he now carried like a lie that had grown heavy, watched competence spread like the opposite of fire. His men were caught up in tasks handed to them by people they had thought beneath their instruction. The image offended him more than smoke stung his eyes. "You fools!" he shouted above the sizzle of wet sacks and the prayer of willow brooms against embers. "You let him teach you how to live. You hand your town to a man who—" He could not finish the sentence because no epithet fit a person putting his body where heat was worst. He looked for a sabotage that would keep him righteous. He found the low run of fence near the arroyo, where Chenoa's scarf of bare earth thinned to nothing against a clump of greasewood. If the backburn leapt there and found the greasewood's oily offering, it would run back into town like a vindication. Rusk swung from his horse and began to kick dirt back onto the line, grinding dry grass into the bare ribbon with his heels, undoing with a minute's meanness what a week of careful patience had built. A boy shouted at him to stop, one of his own, voice cracking with the specific agony of seeing a hero become a hazard. Rusk balled his fist and hit the boy with the back of his hand, not hard enough to break anything but hard enough to break an illusion. The boy fell, and the wind, taking its cues from men as too often happens, pushed flame exactly where Rusk's sabotage wanted it. Chenoa saw the jump before any other eyes read it. He dropped the torch, flung the shovel like a spear into the root, and ran hard toward the greasewood, the motion of a man who knows that sometimes the only answer to catastrophe is to reach it before it knows its name. He hit the patch with his coat, beating as if correcting a child for running into traffic, and the fire, affronted, tried to find another exit. It rushed under the fence and into the corner where Rusk, suddenly unsure of what merit looks like up close, realized he had trapped himself. Smoke took his lungs with the intimacy of a lover gone sour. His rope caught a spark and became a useless ornament on his belt. He stumbled, pitched to his knees, and remembered kneeling being associated with prayer in other times. Chenoa did not think about what the town would make of this, did not calculate the multiplier effect of a gesture witnessed. He threw himself into the corner, grabbed Rusk's belt, familiar leather mean with care, and hauled. The heat climbed his spine like a threat. Flame touched the edges of his shirt and curled back, persuaded by lack of oxygen and the meanness of a coat seam that would not surrender. He got one arm under Rusk's armpit and lifted in the primitive mathematics of rescue. Leverage, grunt, refusal. Rusk flailed in the reflex of men unaccustomed to being helped. Chenoa slammed him against the fence post to shock breath back into a chest that had forgotten its job. Rusk coughed and drew in a lungful of the dirtiest, most beautiful air he had ever tasted. "Don't move," Chenoa said, and Rusk, for the first time in a year, obeyed another man because defiance would have meant burning. The fire at the corner snarled once more, took the hose of sand that a child, Marisol's smallest, eyes wide and brave, threw at it and then turned, confused, toward the line where the backburn waited like a trained dog. Another gust came, and this time it pushed in the right direction, and flame met flame, and discovered it had nothing left to eat. It lay down. It hissed, furious at not being fed, and crawled back up the ridge to look for meals in easier houses. Beatriz nearly missed the turn into the alley by the teacher's house because smoke had made depth a liar. She had hitched the mare and run door to door with a wet scarf around her mouth, banging knuckles until they bled, dragging rugs to cover thresholds, flinging chambers pots where buckets failed. She had evacuated Doña Marta and her coin jars and the old grammar school's tin box of records that would not help anyone breathe, but would help someone later remember they had been citizens. Then she turned toward Doña Pilar's, arms vibrating with the memory of where she had left the drawer and the blue blanket and the smell of chamomile. Smoke has a habit of finding children first. It fits their rooms. It crouches low where they are told to crouch. When she pushed into the old woman's kitchen, the room greeted her with a blind man's shout. The drawer lay open. Doña Pilar had moved the child to carry him, but a stray ember had found the curtain, and the curtain had found the floor, and the floor had found everything it liked about burning. Beatriz's mind did not have time to note the irony of a house built to receive births, flirting now with the opposite. She called, names and not names, and heard only the tin clatter of spoons losing their temper. She ran past the wash basin to the back, where the old woman knelt with the child against her chest, pushing open the yard door with her hip and an oath. Smoke curled around them like a parent with bad posture. "Give him," Beatriz rasped. It was not an order. It was the invocation of an arrangement they had built already in a language older than this town. The old woman did not argue. She handed the child, and the child was a sudden anchor in Beatriz's arms. Heavy, beloved heaviness. His face had the wrong color when a person loves. He wore the gray of a question. She ran, the word out forming in her mouth before her mind chose it. "Back!" she cried, raw and thin, and laced with a grammar every child knows before they learn any others. "Back to me, pequeño, back!" The human voice is not medicine. This is a thing science insists on. The infant in her arms proved that sometimes science does not have enough instruments. He coughed, and the cough had the polite apology of a guest who has overstayed. He coughed again and found in his chest a fistful of air he had not intended to lose. He cried, furious, alive. She swayed as if a current had pulled her and then set her back on shore. They reached the yard where smoke thinned and became merely rude. Beatriz tucked the child under her chin, wrapped the blanket around his face, and turned to see if any part of Doña Pilar's house could be talked back from the brink. Chenoa was there, Rusk crumpled at his feet like an argument expended. The deputy pounded past with a bucket brigade composed of boys who had learned today that heroism looks like repetition. The pastor arrived with his cassock hitched to his knees and his hands blackened and his mouth full of orders. Even he had not known he had the right to give. The councilman carried the shopkeeper's baby because the shopkeeper's wife's hands were needed elsewhere. He did not look as if he were being forced. Reeves stood by the corral gate, the shadow of a man who wanted to be useful and did not yet know the first step. Then he did. He took the jar of nails from the church roofwork and poured them along the road where a wagon would have slid if it tried to flee. The wagon stopped. The driver swore and then realized he had been saved from overturning into flame and shouted a thank you that sounded like confession. Everything moved at once then, and yet with order. The backburn chewed the grass like a cow, given a path to pens. The ditch line held water like a string holds pearls. The goats bawled insults at the fire and were led toward the spring by a girl of 9 with a length of baling twine and no sense of her own heroics. The sheriff dropped his official tone and took on the accent of his childhood, yelling to folks the way his mother had yelled at him to beat the rugs. The deputy found his place between the men who wanted to make noise and the men who wanted to make sense and held them apart with the muscle of his sincerity. The bell in the church rang again of its own accord because heat does that to metal, and everyone pretended not to find it miraculous. Rusk, coughing, tried to stand and declare the day owed him. His legs behaved like a man's legs behave after being dragged from a mistake. They refused speeches. He looked up at Chenoa and failed to say anything about gratitude or shame because the deeper vocabulary that day required was not ready for his mouth. He managed, "Why?" and the single syllable hung between them like a wire. "Because you live here," Chenoa said, "and because if you die, your men will burn more to honor you. I prefer the part where nothing burns." It is possible for a town to change its mind in the time it takes for a shirt to dry. It happens when enough people see something that refuses their favorite lie and cannot be explained away with the old grammar. They saw Chenoa haul the man who wanted him dead out of a corner that Rusk's own foot had set ablaze. They saw Beatriz wrench a baby back into crying with the raw rope of her voice, and then hand that child to a woman who had hidden barbed words in pies and say, "Hold him while I wet the rafters." And the woman did, and she did not cut her hands. They saw the backburn hold the line not because a council had decreed it, but because two people had walked it days ago with shovels and stubbornness. They watched as flame met flame and made the only truce it can, the truce of exhaustion. When the wall arrived, it did so with the inevitability of weather, but it found its meal reduced to crumbs and a crowd too busy to serve. It reared, it tried to get clever. It found itself hemmed where ditch met ditch and where water, smoke, and human intention had drawn a shallow moat. It lunged at the church, and the new patch on the south corner shed its rain of sparks like a roof baptized. It ran for the spring and found damp. It ran for the scarf of bare earth and found its reflection, which in fire's case is appetite denied. For once in a season defined by losses refusing to learn scale, the line held. Silence afterward is not the absence of noise, it is the new sound that rests on top of all the old ones. The town stood in that silence and counted. The church smudged, standing. The teacher's house singed, standing. Doña Pilar's kitchen wall charred, standing. Beatriz standing. The child breathing in little huffs against her collarbone that sounded like someone learning the word here. Chenoa standing, not moving to center or to shadow, an ordinary man who had made a series of exact choices and found himself alive. People began to speak. They did not say big words, because big words sounded cheap in scorched air. "Thank you," said the shopkeeper's wife to Beatriz without codes or accounts. "I was wrong," said the councilman in a voice that barely survived its own audacity. "We follow your plan," the sheriff said to Chenoa. No qualifiers. Doña Pilar, shaky with time owed and collected, lifted the baby from Beatriz's arms and murmured something that might have been the same prayer she had folded earlier, but it sounded less like pleading now and more like gratitude. Rusk sat with his back against the fence post and stared at his hands as if expecting them to confess. He had the dignity not to stand when men came by to see if he intended to reclaim his empire. He let the moment pass because the moment had passed him. He would live with burns that would itch when he wanted to be cruel. Perhaps he would read the itch correctly and find in it a warning. Perhaps not. What mattered was that the town now owned an image that contradicted his favorite sermon. The man he hated yanking him through heat and ordering him not to die. Beatriz found Chenoa with her eyes, and he found her with his, and the moment contained too much smoke and work to do anything pretty with it. She stepped toward him and put her free hand on his shoulder, the right one, where the scar ran like a map of wrong turns corrected. He put his palm, black with ash and lined with the ghosts of other days' labor, on the child's back, where breath lived. Neither spoke apology or promise. The town did that for them with its new habit of looking at the evidence in front of it before letting old myths speak. The wind shifted after sundown, becoming a version of itself that remembered kindness. Men walked the line and stamped the sullen edges. Women counted blankets and children and jars, and the number of small mercies a day can be made of when people decide to count those instead of grievances. The deputy sat on the church steps and wrote nothing. He let the report gather inside him into a shape he would recognize later. The pastor leaned his head back, grey with soot, and laughed from the belly like a child who has used his body well. Reeves, alone for a sliver, took off his hat and looked at the patch of sky above his head and said a thing he had not said since he was 12. "I'm sorry." The sky accepted without requiring proof. Skies are generous when houses have not burned. Night finally claimed the day with a gentleness it had not shown in weeks. Embers winked along the ridge like small towns in a better country. The ditch whispered itself to sleep. The spring continued its old gossip with the rocks about how humans make the same mistakes in different costumes, and how sometimes, not often, they make a correction that sticks. In the house that had opened its door, and then its roof, and then its entire being to a string of necessary verbs, Beatriz laid the child down and counted, not breaths now, but futures. Chenoa stood at the threshold and for once did not place himself between anything and anything. He let the door hold itself. When they finally let go of each other's hands, it was not because either had decided to. It was because the town had tugged gently and asked to be held too. Morning found the town in a color it did not yet have a name for. Ash had fallen in the night with the primness of confetti, at a celebration no one would have planned, laying itself over fences and wash lines and the bell tower's patched corner. The light came thin at first, as if the sun were peering through a veil held up by the stubborn remnant of smoke. Quiet sat on roofs and thresholds and refused to move. Even dogs tested their voices before committing to a bark. When Beatriz stepped onto the porch, boots scuffing a soft grey that lifted like breath at each step, the mule looked at her with eyes rimmed in white dust and sighed, a long exhale that sounded suspiciously like gratitude disguised as work. The line had held. The proof lay in the arithmetic of what stood. The church, blackened at the eaves but upright, wore its new patch like a medal earned without swagger. Doña Pilar's kitchen wall, charred to the height of a woman's waist, still held the shelf where a row of jars, clouded with smoke, glowed weakly as if remembering sunlight. The schoolhouse had a new scar in the shape of a godless crescent on its north wall, where someone, no one would admit who, which is the right way to carry certain deeds, had slapped wet quilts until the wood agreed to live. The teacher traced the curve with a finger and found it foreign and good. It would change how she taught circles to children whose futures still assumed roofs. Loss was not absent. A shed at the edge of town lay collapsed, a low black sentence written in a language only men who keep tools learn to read. Its owner stood over it with the resigned expression of a person remembering that everything they build contains its own exit. 2 chicken coops had gone, one with more noise than dignity, and a cottonwood branch heavy with last year's nests had surrendered, only to land square on the water trough where it smothered the ember that had planned to crawl there as if called. People paused at such marks of luck and did not say the word. They gripped a shoulder, set down a bucket, looked at the ground to steady their eyes. Chenoa walked the scarf along the fence, each bootfall a note added to the map of a morning he had rehearsed in his head 100 times in other lands without the town in it. He nudged the toe of his boot into the seam where bare earth met blackened grass, testing for heat hidden under the sulk of ash. On a higher patch, he crouched and sifted white powder until his fingers found a coal the size of a thumbnail, winking like a guilt that refuses to die without being confessed. He dropped it into a bucket and listened to the hiss, as if it were a sentence he could agree to. Behind him, children tried to learn the game of stamping on cold with the solemnity of apprentices. He did not tell them to stop. He showed them the trick of weighing with the hand first. Ash lies about temperature, and hands tell a kinder truth than boots. Beatriz moved through the street with a broom and a bucket, and the baby tied to her chest. The strap threaded in the way Chenoa had taught that keeps small bodies high when a rider must bend to work. The child slept, head turned to the hollow of her throat where the smoke smell had become a second weather. When he stirred, it was to test the air with his mouth as if tasting a word, and when his breath caught, the tiny hitch that still made her heart turn guard, he found a rhythm again without her having to call it. She swept steps without asking permission and set clean water at thresholds without asking forgiveness. In the brush of her broom and the thunk of her pail, she heard, faint and astonished, a version of her former life loosening its grip. People met her eyes differently. The shopkeeper, whose ledger had learned shame at last, came out with his apron already dusty and held out a tin of nails. He did not speak until he had placed it in her hands. "For whatever needs holding," he said, and his voice was as raw as anyone's that morning. He seemed to want to add a confession and found his throat unwilling to make a spectacle of it. She spared him and nodded once. The absolution of a woman who believes in receipts but will not demand one for an act done right. The councilman, hat in hands, as if hats had suddenly become too heavy for heads that had sheltered behind their brims, stood near the church steps and waited to be told his part. He had slept badly and dreamt of the word must rolling down a street toward a fire, like a barrel that had broken free of a truck, crushing smaller words beneath it. Now he approached Beatriz like a man bringing home a borrowed tool, much improved. "We are convening at noon," he said, voice careful as a man picking his way across a creek on loose stones. "Not a regular council, a reckoning. The paper from Dean's County is being reconsidered," he swallowed. "We were wrong to abdicate. I was wrong. I will say so where a bell can hear me." "Do, say it so a broom can hear you," she answered, pointing with her chin at the pile of ash on the steps, and to his credit, he bent without drama and swept in a rhythm that was almost penance and almost relief. Later, he would manage Latin about rescinding orders and instituting new appointments. Now, his body needed a verb it could trust. Rusk had not left town overnight. He had sat against a fence post until it learned his weight, and then learned to dislike it. In the morning, his hands, bandaged with strips of cloth that smelled of honey and something bitter the traveling trader had left, lay in his lap like chastened animals. He had always thought himself larger than his body, the kind of man whose will enlarges a room simply by occupying it. Now the room had grown and he had not. He watched Chenoa move along the fence line with a steadiness that required no audience and felt a confusion that embarrassed him because it came with envy inside it, envy of competence that did not need to change its voice to be obeyed. Twice he got up to go to Chenoa and twice sat down again because going wrong would be worse than staying wrong, and he did not yet know how to do the first right. Reeves wandered at the margins of usefulness, carrying a bucket too full, because he did not know yet that you leave room for a spill if your hands shake. He had slept in starts, waking at every creak of the cooling earth, each sound a jury coming back. He had practiced apologies and rejected them because they sounded like begging the world to keep him on payroll. When he saw Beatriz crossing the yard near the spring, he moved toward her and then stopped a pace short, which is an honest distance. "I told him about the water," he said. It came out without preface. "I told him because I was small, and I wanted the day smaller. I wanted him smaller. I see I made the wrong thing big." He swallowed. "Let me mend the gate you always meant to get to and never needed to because you made do." She watched him for a heartbeat that allowed neither absolution nor punishment time to take the stage. "Mend the gate," she said, "then come to the meeting and say what you told me in a voice that can be heard past the first pew." He nodded, as if she had handed him a sentence to memorize for school, which she had, and he went to fetch a hammer he would, for once, set back in the right direction when he was done. The deputy had become an early riser overnight, drawn from his bed by the same compulsion that brings men to the scene of their making and their unmaking. He found the sheriff near the horses, hands on hips, considering the animals with a brand new respect for creatures that carry people through their own foolishness without complaint. The sheriff had written nothing yet. The forms in his saddlebag looked like small coffins. "We need to make a statement," he said to the deputy, then shook his head hard as if to clear tinder from his hair. "No, we need to make amends. We need to make a plan that isn't just words men can hide inside." "Chenoa has a plan," the deputy said. He did not mean to sound like a boy bragging about a friend. He did anyway, and the sheriff, who had hated ladders since childhood because he had once been left halfway up one by cousins with louder laughs, smiled despite himself. By noon, the ash had settled into the creases of men's hands and into the lines by women's mouths, making worlds of age and worry visible where they had previously played at hiding. The church filled without the bell having to be coaxed. It had always been better at calling fire than at calling people. Today, people arrived without being scolded to. The patched south corner looked smug. The pastor thought it had earned a day of pride and did not scold it either. He stood at the front with his collar open, unafraid to look human in a room that had been saved by humans. He had spoken to God in the hours before dawn and had heard nothing back but God's usual stubborn silence. It had felt less like abandonment than like a reminder to use what he had been given. The councilman spoke first because he had insisted on speaking first, and no one had the energy to rearrange a man's hunger for position when he was about to spend it correctly. He spoke plainly. "We turned a person into a procedure," he said, and the sentence had the merit of precision. "We abdicated our duty to deliberate in favor of a document that said it would think for us. The description from Dean's County did not match the man we tied. We said it did because our fear wanted a simple verb." He looked at the sheriff, who looked back and did not flinch from being looked at. "From this day, any order to remove a neighbor will require proof you can touch, not rumors you can repeat, and signatures we will own in daylight. We rescind the previous order. We ask—" Here he faltered, anticipating laughter that did not come. "We ask Chenoa to stay, not as a favor to us, as a ranger paid by us. Teach us the work we learned yesterday only in the shallow part. Track, firecraft, water wisdom. The county will fund it. The budget can stand to lose 2 ceremonial lunches a year." Laughter came then, because people needed to know their throats still could, and it did not sound unkind. Eyes turned toward Chenoa as if the room had decided to be a compass. He stood at the side aisle. He had cleaned his hands but not scrubbed them of their knowledge. He looked like a man taught to distrust gatherings who had nonetheless attended, a person whose spine had learned to be both guardrail and bridge. He did not step forward because stepping forward would centralize him, and he had seen already what happens when a single person is asked to carry a town's projection of virtue. He lifted his chin a fraction, which in some languages means yes, and in others means I will answer. In his mouth it meant both. "I will teach what can be taught," he said, voice so plain the rafters had to lean to hear. "Fire is not a dog to be tamed, it is a language. Water is not a servant, it is a path. I will show you what I know about both, so you stop treating them like enemies and start treating them like conditions. I have one condition." Heads tipped, prepared for something costly. He gave them something heavier and cheaper. No more night justice. If a man is to be judged, let the sun see it. Let the boys watch so they learn the difference between theater and decision. Let the women stand at the back, not because it keeps them safe, but because it makes the front honest. The deputy said, without checking first with his superior, "Done." And the sheriff, to his credit in a room that remembered rope too sharply, said, "Done," as if he had written it already and could not be talked out of it. Doña Pilar set her palms on the pew in front of her and pushed herself to her feet with the aid of old wills. "Pay him fair," she croaked. "Rangers do not live on gratitude and the leftovers of a bake sale." In a better world, that sentence would have been comic. Here it landed like a tired truth, deciding to take a chair in the middle of the room. The councilman nodded and made a note on the back of the only paper handy. The sheriff's copied description of a man who did not live here. He wrote across it a sum that would mean fewer flowers at his wife's next birthday. She would forgive him. The town would buy her dahlias. Then Rusk stood, and the quiet shifted from courtesy to interest, sharpened. He had considered staying seated and letting the day move past him, and had discovered that the day was in no mood to be eluded. He walked to the aisle with the awkwardness of a man relearning his own gait. He faced Chenoa because the geometry of the room insisted on that line. His bandaged hands hung useless, which for him were hands overdue a lesson. "I owe you," he said, and his voice tried to find its old swagger and failed, stumbled, and settled into something humbler. "I owe you breath. I owe you my boy's chance to see me make a change instead of a scene. You pulled me from a corner I had no business being in, set me back upright, told me not to die. You have my thanks." He paused. That should have been the end of it. Thank you is a hard verb for his kind, and often the only one available. But he had one more sentence and forced himself to say it. You have my apology to both of you, he added, indicating Beatrice, without daring to meet her eyes, because to meet them would be to drown in the current there. I made fear into a law I could carry in my belt. I will carry different now. He did not promise what. Wisdom had not made him poetic overnight. He sat, and his men, those still willing to belong to him, shifted in their seats, some in discomfort, some in relief, some plotting how to tell the story later without shrinking themselves. The pastor, who had been brave yesterday and would spend the next week fearing his courage had been a fluke, lifted his hands as if to bless and then let them fall because the room did not need the word. He said something he had practiced and then thrown away twice. We have always prayed for rain. Pray now for a different weather, for days in which competence is honored in time to prevent miracles being required. It was clumsy as liturgy goes. It was exactly right for the hour. After the meeting, town leaked into street in clusters, breaking and reforming like the currents under a low bridge. Decisions made under roofs must move into air to count. The sheriff cornered the councilman and made him repeat aloud the part about paying. Repetition is a ritual men devise to bind themselves to what they suspect they will attempt to wiggle around later. The deputy shook Chenoa's hand in the open and then, oddly, turned his palm so that their fingers interlaced for the second of an old pledge. There will be nights when a deputy eats that promise like a bitter herb, and it will keep him from a wrong door. The shopkeeper's daughter, whose bun had come unstuck sometime after midnight and now looped wild at her ear, stood staring at the patched roof and said to anyone who would hear a girl's version of law, "It is good to fix." Beatriz walked with Chenoa back toward the ranch, which was not a ranch only anymore, but a word that might also mean school. The ditch murmured their passing like an old aunt not above gossip. Ash lifted in puffs and started to settle again farther downwind. Dust doing what dust does, finding every surface, asserting that everything belongs to everything else. They did not hurry. They were both for a day forgiven for not hurrying. He carried the shovel not like a weapon, but like a staff. She shifted the child to her hip so he could watch the world without feeling subordinate to it. They reached the spring and stood in its narrow cleft without speaking, because there are places that demand silence, even from people who have earned speech several times over. "This water was yours before you knew it," she said finally, and the sentence did what all good ones do. It yielded more than it consumed. I kept it a whisper. I am willing to teach it a louder voice. With you. He knelt and pressed his hands into the seep so that the mud came up between his fingers and cooled the hot ache left by yesterday's heat. Then we will build a cover that hides it from maps and teaches it to run when we ask. We will plant willow here that will suck greedily so the rest can drink. We will bury a pipe where no curious man can follow the rattle of it. We will let the goats insult it from a distance and keep their hooves far from it. We will ask it to be our partner. We will not tell it what to be. He looked up at her hands on the child and at the child's fist, now opening and closing in the sunlight as if grabbing and releasing light could be the first trick of living. "There are 2 springs, he added, so soft she almost did not hear. "This one, and the one behind your ribs that we kept from being paved over with fear." She blushed. It was a rare weather for her face, and all the more beautiful because it did not exile intelligence to make room for it. "Don't make a poem of me," she said. "Build a wall where goats won't ruin what feeds us. Teach me how to read the shadow of a false track so I can show the boys to stop practicing righteousness on people who are simply on their way home." "I will," he said. It was a promise without embroidery. It found a shelf in both of them where they would keep it next to other sturdy things: rope, salt, sorrow. By late afternoon, people returned objects to people. A cast-iron pot showed up on a step with the soot rubbed off and no note. A boy delivered a tin soldier he had stolen from a neighbor's shelf months ago and had forgotten to feel guilty about until he saw a man haul his hero out of flame. He handed it over without ceremony and discovered that the stomachache that had been with him all summer eased. The traveling trader rolled through with a bag of pears too soft for a longer trip and a box of dress buttons that looked like coins. He held Beatriz's gaze as he offered water and news, saw the bruise fading to yellow at her cheek and the steadiness at her mouth, and tipped his hat the way men do when they have run out of better gestures. At dusk, the wind died as if it too needed to rest from the job of being mule and bully both. People had put away buckets and dragged damp rugs over porch rails and were starting to discover hunger. The pastor rang the bell once, not to call but to thank, and the sound went low over the houses and lay down on the ditch like a blanket. Chenoa sat on the porch step sharpening a hoe with the small care that makes implements outlast decisions. Beatriz came out with a bowl of beans and sliced onion and 2 pieces of bread that had survived being thrown at a fire because she had been taught somewhere long ago that food becomes holy if it shows up for both weddings and the moments when walls do not fall down. She handed him the bread and without theatrics tore a piece for herself. The child gnawed a strip of cloth with the concentration of a scholar. Rusk approached then, hat in his hands again, posture made honest by the ache in his back. He had rehearsed a dozen lines. They fell away. He stood at the fence like a man at the edge of a pool he has been told is safe. "I came to say what I tried to say in there without all those eyes," he managed. "Thank you," he added as if asked by a schoolmarm to use his words in a sentence. "I will not ride knights." It sounded like a vow, only because it would cost him his favorite mask. He glanced at Beatriz's hands, work rough, steady, and his mouth tightened with something that might, years from now, become tenderness for women whose competence scared him because it required him to stop pretending he had cornered strength. He reached into his pocket and brought out the sheriff's paper with the description and held it out. "We don't need this anymore," he said. She took it and used it to light the stove that night. Reeves finished the gate, discovered that he liked the sound a hinge makes when it says yes without squealing, and stood back to admire how unnoticed good work is once it is done. He did not knock on Beatriz's door to summon witnesses. He waited until she came out to check the latch and then asked, without pride and without servility, "What else?" She pointed at the shed that had been leaning toward collapse before the fire considered finishing the job. "The brace," she said. "And then come back tomorrow for whatever I have not noticed because I was busy noticing a different crisis." He nodded and went home past the church where the deputy sat with his boots off, massaging a blister that would turn his walk into a sermon for a week. "You did good," Reeves told the deputy. It felt like handing a canteen to himself in another life. The deputy took the praise like a man who had learned it might not always be his. He said, "we did good." A day. Inside, the baby slept the satisfying sleep of small animals that have been allowed to feel their mother's heart drum next to their own. Beatriz watched his mouth and would not call the thing that spread in her chest happiness, because happiness had been for years too expensive a word to keep on hand. She called it a clean room. She allowed herself to imagine places where the child would take his first laugh, under the cottonwood in the yard when the wind pretends to be invisible and fails, in the church where the patched corner will drip a perfect dram of rain on his nose some later spring, at the spring itself, dappled by leaves she hasn't planted yet, because planting is a declaration she intends to nurture. She let the image of Chenoa in that room appear without pushing it away. A man at the table mending a strap while the child invents a language no one will understand, and she, mixing something in a bowl, finds she can listen to 2 men's quiet at once and call it music. Chenoa had his own weather inside. Relief wore off in him the way a salve does when you work too soon, still there but thinner. Underneath it, a slow warmth grew, the kind that makes a man think of building not as repentance for destruction, but as worship without a preacher. He imagined a fire break laid farther north, a scrape cut along the ridge so clean that even a drunk wind would trip over it and learn manners. He imagined a set of young men and women. He would insist on both, learning to read sign, not for the chest beating of it, but to find lost children and strayed cows and neighbors who had wandered too far into their own trouble. He imagined teaching the council how to tell the difference between a rumor and a report, by walking with them to the place the rumor said held proof and finding only jackrabbit scat and the track of a snake that had changed its mind. He imagined singing at night and not having to lower his voice because no one would mistake song for weakness anymore. He imagined telling the child later about a woman who could say stay as if it were shelter rather than command. When the moon lifted, the ash looked like frost and the town, bizarrely, like a postcard sent from a kinder season. Wolves did not howl, coyotes did, but with the embarrassed yips of animals who had run the ridge and found it already occupied by human mess. The spring whispered its ongoing gossip, the ditch gurgled, the patched roof held its counsel. Beatriz sat on the step with the child asleep between her knees and watched a moth commit itself to a lantern and then think better of it. She considered the vow she had made years ago, beside a bed that had done its worst to keep alive a man whose body had chosen otherwise. I will not bury another loved one. It had kept her hard, where softness would have made better use of her. It had been for a time a life raft. She had mistaken it for a boat. Tonight she amended it without ceremony. I will not let fear choose whom I love or how. I will not be tricked into thinking sorrow is the only honest outcome. If the wind rises, I will shut the windows where I must and open the door where I can. The child made a sound in his sleep like someone agreeing. Chenoa took up the old lullaby and found himself at a loss for the syllables he had used when the world was another shape. He did not reach back for them out of habit. He made a new thing, the way men make a path by walking it twice. He set a melody on the low notes the ditch favored, and on the long vowels, Beatriz's name seemed to teach his mouth to hold. He took a 4-note phrase his mother had used to call goats in at dusk and wove it to a cadence he had learned from the church bell's unsure start and certain finish. It was not beautiful at first. It was exact. He sang about a small boat and a line and a bank that will hold. He sang about smoke that forgets to be threat and decides to be perfume. He sang about a door. He did not say hope. He did not have to. Hope sat on the step with them and leaned its shoulder against the jamb and kept the hinges oiled with a natural hand. The baby's breath settled into the pace of the song. The night, which had spent so long bullying, stood in the yard and listened and did not interrupt. Before sleep, as happens on the nights that pin the ends of eras together, the town moved in its beds and practiced new talk. The shopkeeper spoke out loud, to no one, lamp oil, and laughed dryly at how words hide other words until somebody lifts a roof. The councilman said, right shoulder, and did not know he had said it and dreamed of turning a paper over and seeing a real face. The deputy, who would in time leave the county to take a job in a place where a man with a conscience gets fewer promotions, but more mornings he can recognize himself, dreamed of a ladder with a rung exactly where he needed it. Reeves dreamed that gates do not squeal if you set them right the first time. Rusk dreamed he was rubbing salve into his own palm, and the pain did not go away but became manageable, which is better. The pastor dreamed generously of a sermon in which the only text was a shovel, and people sat through it and afterwards asked for copies. Morning would come again, with chores, with fences that do not repair virtue and still must be tended, with the kind of gossip that returns when adrenaline goes home. Men would forget parts of what they promised, and women would remember more than they wanted, and children would practice being awful for an hour at a time, because children must, to test the strength of a town's recalibrated patience. But for now, in the clean draft that follows a good burn, a door stood propped and did not close when the wind teased it. In the ledger of debts, kept not with ink but with days, mercy had begun finally to outnumber fear and to accrue interest that did not come due in rope. The baby rolled in his sleep and found his fist open with nothing in it and did not wake to protest. Beatriz, hearing that small act of trust, let her head tip onto Chenoa's shoulder with the caution of a woman who has practiced denying herself softness and is teaching her muscles the opposite. He did not startle. He turned his cheek and rested it on her hair. They watched the last ash, lifting in sun like snow that has reconsidered its vocation and chosen to be merely beautiful. They were not masters of a future. They were citizens of a morning. When the wind rose as it will, they would stand and set the line again and again, and each time flame met flame, they would ask it to remember the lesson of this day, that some lines hold, not by accident, but by people who choose each other and then choose again until choosing becomes the way the door stays open.